I had reported the following to my boss over the radio one last time. There's a strange situation at the station. The customer isn't getting out of the car, but the engine isn't running either. He's been waiting in the same position for 3 hours. My boss's response changed my life. Marcus, you're on your own. There's no one else on the cameras. Asterisk, my name is Marcus Chen, and I've been working the graveyard shift at Jimmy's 24-hour gas station on Highway 49 for 8 years now. 8 long years of dealing with drunk college kids, truckers hopped up on caffeine, and the occasional tweaker looking for an easy score. I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me. I was wrong. The night everything changed was October 15th, 2023. It was a Sunday, which meant the station was quieter than usual. Most people were home getting ready for the work week, leaving me with just the overnight regulars and the random traveler passing through our small town of Cedar Falls, Nevada. The weather was crisp but not cold, with that clear desert air that makes the stars look like pinpricks in black velvet. I'd been on shift since 10 p.m., and by 2:30 a.m., I'd only had maybe 6 customers. A trucker getting coffee and diesel, a young couple on their way to Vegas, a local rancher picking up cigarettes and energy drinks. Normal stuff. The kind of quiet night where you can catch up on inventory, clean the coffee machine, and maybe sneak in some reading during the dead hours. That's when I first saw him. The headlights appeared from the east, cutting through the darkness as they approached the station. Nothing unusual about that. Highway 49 sees traffic at all hours. People driving between Reno and Las Vegas who prefer the scenic route to the interstate. But something about these headlights caught my attention. Maybe it was the way they moved, too steady, too purposeful. Most drivers at this hour show some signs of fatigue, slight weaving, occasional speed changes. These lights came straight and true, like they were being guided by GPS rather than human hands. The vehicle pulled into the station and stopped at Pump 3. It was a dark blue Ford F-150, probably 10 years old, with Nevada plates. The engine shut off immediately, which was normal. What wasn't normal was what happened next. Nothing. The driver's door didn't open. No one got out to pump gas. The truck just sat there, silent and still under the harsh fluorescent lights that illuminated the pump island. I waited for a couple of minutes, figuring maybe the driver was finishing a phone call or looking for his wallet. But the minutes stretched on, and still nothing. I could see a figure behind the wheel. Just a silhouette really, but definitely someone sitting in the driver's seat. The windows were tinted dark enough that I couldn't make out any details, just the vague shape of a person who seemed to be waiting. But waiting for what? After about 10 minutes, I decided to check on them. Sometimes people fall asleep at the wheel, especially on long drives through the desert. I'd found more than one traveler who'd pulled in for gas and dozed off from exhaustion. Usually, a gentle tap on the window was enough to rouse them. I walked out from behind the counter, the electronic chime announcing my exit into the night air. The desert was silent except for the distant hum of the station's generators and the occasional 18-wheeler passing on the highway. As I approached the truck, I could see the figure more clearly through the windshield. It was a man, probably middle-aged based on his build, wearing what looked like a dark jacket or hoodie. His hands were on the steering wheel in the 10-2 position, and he was sitting perfectly upright. Not the posture of someone who'd fallen asleep. More like someone who was actively driving, except the truck wasn't moving. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached the driver's side. "Everything okay out here?" No response. The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I moved closer and tapped gently on the window. "Sir? You need any help?" Still nothing. The man, and I was certain it was a man now, continued to sit motionless, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead through the windshield. It was like he was frozen in place, or like he was watching something I couldn't see. I tried the passenger side. thinking maybe he hadn't heard me through the driver's window. As I rounded the front of the truck, I got a better look at him through the windshield. He appeared to be in his 40s, with dark hair and pale skin. His eyes were open, but they had a strange glassy quality that reminded me of a mannequin. He was definitely awake, but there was something off about his expression. No emotion, no awareness of his surroundings. Just ... blank. Sir? I called. Out again, louder this time. Are you feeling all right? The man's head turned slowly toward me, and for a moment our eyes met through the glass. What I saw there made my blood run cold. His eyes were completely black, not dark brown or hazel black, like looking into two empty holes where eyes should be. And when he looked at me, his mouth curved into what might have been a smile. But it was wrong somehow. Too wide, showing too many teeth. I backed away from the truck, my heart hammering in my chest. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back inside the station and call for help. But as I retreated, the man's head swiveled to follow my movement, that horrible not-quite smile never wavering. I made it back to the station and immediately locked the door behind me, something I rarely did during operating hours. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone to call my supervisor, Jake Reeves, who lived about 20 minutes away and served as the district manager for our chain of stations. Jake, it's Marcus at the 49 station, I said when he picked up, my voice probably betraying more anxiety than I intended. I've got a situation here that I'm not sure how to handle. What kind of situation? Jake's voice was groggy but alert. He'd been doing this job long enough to know that late-night calls usually meant trouble. There's a customer who pulled up to pump 3 about 15 minutes ago, but he hasn't gotten out of his truck. When I went to check on him, well, there's something wrong with him, Jake. Something really wrong. Wrong how? Is he sick? Drunk? I tried to explain what I'd seen, but it sounded crazy, even to my own ears. Black eyes, unnatural smile, sitting motionless for 20 minutes without pumping gas or showing any normal human behavior. Jake listened patiently, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. Marcus, you've been working too many doubles lately. Maybe you're just tired, seeing things that aren't there. Why don't you just ask him if he needs help, and if he's not buying anything, ask him to move along. Jake, I'm telling you, something is seriously wrong with this guy. Can you come down here? There was a pause, and I could hear Jake sighing. All right, I'll head over. But in the meantime, just keep an eye on him from inside the station. Don't go back out there alone. After hanging up, I positioned myself behind the counter where I could watch the truck through the large front windows. The man was still there, still in the exact same position. For the next 20 minutes, until Jake arrived, that figure didn't move so much as an inch. No shifting in his seat, no checking his phone, no normal human fidgeting. He just sat there. Like a statue. Jake's headlights appeared on the highway at 3:15 a.m., and I felt a wave of relief as his pickup truck pulled into the station lot. Jake was in his 50s, a former Marine who'd worked in the gas station business for over 20 years. If anyone could handle a weird situation, it was him. He parked near the station entrance and walked over to where I was waiting by the door. "So where's this mysterious customer?" he asked, scanning the lot. I pointed toward pump 3. "Right there. Blue Ford pickup." Jake looked where I was pointing, then back at me with confusion. "Marcus, there's no truck at pump 3. I spun around. To look through the window, pump 3 was empty. The blue Ford F-150 was gone. But that was impossible. I'd been watching it continuously since I called Jake, and I hadn't seen it leave. There'd been no sound of an engine starting, no headlights pulling away. The truck had simply vanished. "That's impossible," I said, pressing my face against the glass. It was right there. I've been watching it this whole time. Jake walked over to pump 3 and examined the area carefully. No tire tracks, no oil stains, Nothing to indicate a vehicle was here recently. Marcus, are you sure you saw what you think you saw? I was sure. Completely, absolutely sure. But the evidence was right there in front of us, or rather, the lack of evidence. No truck, no trace that anyone had been there. Just an empty pump island under the fluorescent lights. Maybe I should take a look at the security footage, Jake suggested, and we went inside to check the cameras. Our security system recorded everything in the lot from 4 different angles, with footage stored digitally for 30 days. If there had been a truck at Pump 3, it would definitely be on camera. Jake pulled up the footage from the past hour, and we watched it together on the small monitor behind the counter. What we saw made no sense. The footage showed me working normally, occasionally looking out the window. At 2:47 a.m., I could be seen walking outside and approaching Pump 3, but there was no truck there. On camera, I appeared to be talking to empty air, looking concerned, and backing away from nothing. Then I hurried back inside and made the phone call to Jake. "This is impossible," I muttered, staring at the screen. The truck was right there. I touched the window. Jake rewound. I saw him and played it again. Same result. According to the cameras, I had walked out to an empty pump island and had some kind of episode where I started talking to myself and acting frightened of nothing. "Marcus," Jake said gently, "when's the last time you had a full night's sleep? You've been pulling a lot of overtime lately, and stress can do funny things to people." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd seen was real, but how could I argue with video evidence? The cameras clearly showed that no vehicle had been at Pump 3 during the time I claimed to have seen the truck. Either I was losing my mind, or something very strange was happening that the cameras somehow couldn't record. Jake stayed with me for the rest of my shift, which ended at 6 a.m. when the day manager arrived. We didn't talk much about the incident, but I could tell he was worried about me. Before he left, he suggested I take a few days off to rest, maybe see a doctor if I was having trouble distinguishing between reality and hallucinations. I drove home in the early morning light, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I really imagined the whole thing? It seemed impossible. The experience had been so vivid, so real. I could still remember the feeling of my knuckles tapping against the truck's window, the sound of my voice calling out to the driver. Most of all, I could remember those black eyes looking back at me. But the cameras didn't lie. According to the objective electronic record, nothing had happened. I had simply walked outside, acted strangely for a few minutes, then rushed back inside to call my supervisor about a customer who didn't exist. I didn't sleep well that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face with the too wide smile and the black, empty eyes. When I finally drifted off around noon, I had strange dreams about driving through an endless desert, following headlights that stayed always just ahead of me, no matter how fast I drove. I was scheduled to work again that night, but Jake called around 4 p.m. to tell me he'd covered my shift and that I should take a few days to rest. He also mentioned that he'd called our company's employee assistance program to set up a counseling appointment for me. It was clear he thought I was having some kind of mental health crisis. Maybe he was right. Maybe the stress of working nights. For 8 years, the isolation, the constant exposure to the weird and dangerous elements that come out after dark, maybe it had finally gotten to me. People who work alone overnight develop all kinds of psychological issues. Insomnia, depression, anxiety, and yes, sometimes hallucinations. But I knew what I'd seen. 3 days later, I returned to work. Jake had arranged for Tommy Martinez, one of our part-time employees, to work the first few hours of my shift with me, just to make sure I was okay. Tommy was a good kid, early 20s, working his way through community college. He'd been with the company for about 2 years and knew how to handle most situations that came up during the night shift. The evening started normally. We had the usual flow of customers, commuters heading home late, people picking up snacks and drinks, a few truckers getting fuel and coffee. Around 11 p.m., Tommy went home, leaving me alone for the remainder of the shift. I was determined to prove to myself and to Jake that I was fine, that the incident 3 nights ago had been some kind of isolated stress reaction. I'd gotten some sleep, eaten well, and felt mentally sharp. Whatever had happened before wouldn't happen again. At 2:30 a.m., the station was quiet again. I was restocking the cooler when I heard the familiar sound of a vehicle pulling up to the pumps. I looked up to see headlights at pump 3. My blood turned to ice. It was the same blue Ford F-150, same Nevada plates, same dark-tinted windows. And as I watched, the engine shut off and the headlights died, leaving the truck sitting in exactly the same position as before. This time, I didn't wait. I immediately went to the security monitor and pulled up the live camera feed from pump 3. On the screen, I could see my own face reflected in the monitor, but behind me, through the window, the pump island appeared empty. But when I turned to look directly through the window, the truck was there. I ran outside, no longer caring about protocol or safety. I had to prove to myself that this was real, that I wasn't losing my mind. The truck was solid and real under the fluorescent lights. I could see my reflection in its chrome bumper, could smell the faint odor of motor oil and rubber that all vehicles carry. The driver was in the same position as before, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead, wearing the same dark jacket. As I approached, his head turned toward me with that same mechanical movement, and once again I found myself looking into those impossible black eyes. This time, though, I was ready for it. I pulled out my phone and tried to take a picture, but when I looked at the camera screen, it showed only empty asphalt. The truck wasn't there. Even though I was standing right next to it, even though I could touch it, my phone's camera couldn't see it. What are you? I whispered. The thing in the truck turned its head further, rotating almost 180 degrees to keep looking at me as I moved around the vehicle. The smile grew wider, and I could see that its teeth were too sharp, too numerous. Like a shark's mouth rather than a human's. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the driver. As I retreated, the truck's engine started, even though the driver's hands never moved from the steering wheel. The headlights came on, but they weren't normal automotive lights. They were the same impossible black as the driver's eyes, creating cones of darkness rather than illumination. The truck began to move, but not forward or backward. It rose slowly into the air, hovering about 3 feet off the ground. The wheels weren't spinning. The engine made no sound despite the exhaust visible in the cold night air. It was simply floating, defying every law of physics I understood. As it hung there in the air, more vehicles began to appear. Not driving into the station, but materializing out of the darkness like ghosts becoming solid. Another pickup truck, this one red, took position at pump 2. A sedan appeared at pump 1. An old van materialized at pump 4. Each vehicle contained a driver similar to the first, pale, motionless figures with black eyes and 2 wide smiles. They all turned to look at me as their vehicles hovered silently above the pumps. I ran back into the station and grabbed the phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency? This is Marcus Chen, Jimmy's gas station on Highway 49. I need police out here immediately. There are vehicles here that aren't normal. They're floating, and the drivers aren't human. Sir, can you repeat that? Did you say floating vehicles? Yes, they're hovering above the pumps. The drivers have black eyes and they're all looking at me. Please, send someone. We're dispatching a unit to your location. Stay on the line with me. Are you in immediate danger? I looked out the window. All 4 vehicles were now facing the station, their impossible black headlights creating shadows that moved independently of their sources. The drivers were all turned toward me, watching through the glass. I don't know, I said into the phone. They're just watching me, but they're not human. I'm certain they're not human. The 911 operator kept me on the line, asking questions and trying to keep me calm while police were en route. But I could barely focus on her words because the scene outside was becoming even more impossible. More vehicles were appearing, filling every available space around the station. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, even what looked like an old school bus, all hovering silently with their inhuman drivers watching me through the windows. The station lot, which could normally accommodate maybe 20 vehicles, now held at least 50, all suspended in the air like ornaments on an invisible Christmas tree. The police arrived 15 minutes later, the longest 15 minutes of my life. I watched through the window as the patrol car's headlights swept across the lot as it pulled in. The officer got out and walked toward the station, his flashlight beam cutting through the night. But according to his movements, he saw nothing unusual. He walked directly through the space where the hovering vehicles should have been, his light passing through them without effect. To him, the lot was empty except for my car parked near the station entrance. When he came inside, Officer Dennis Crawford was someone I knew from previous incidents at the station. He was a good cop, professional and fair, but the look on his face told me he'd been briefed about my previous episode. "Marcus, dispatch says you called about floating vehicles with inhuman drivers. I've walked the entire lot, and there's nothing here except your car." "They're right there," I said, pointing through the window. "At least 50 of them. They're all watching us." Officer Crawford followed my gaze, then looked back at me with concern. "Marcus, there's nothing there. The lot is empty." I looked at the security monitor, knowing what I'd see but hoping otherwise. The cameras showed Officer Crawford and his patrol car, my vehicle, and empty pumps. No floating vehicles, no impossible drivers, nothing to corroborate what I was seeing with my own eyes. "I think you need to come with me," Officer Crawford said gently. "We can get you some help." As he spoke, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. When he wasn't looking directly at me, when his attention was focused on his radio or his notepad, his reflection in the station's windows showed black eyes. The same impossible black eyes I'd seen in his reflection, and realized it wasn't quite right. His uniform was different in the mirror, older, like something from decades past. And his face, while similar to the Officer Crawford I knew, was subtly wrong. The features were too sharp, the smile too wide. "You're one of them," I whispered. The thing wearing Officer Crawford's face stopped pretending to write in its notepad and looked up at me. Its smile widened, showing those too numerous, too sharp teeth. "One of what, Marcus?" it asked, but its voice had changed. It was deeper now, with an echo that seemed to come from somewhere far away. I ran. Not toward the door, because the thing that looked like Officer Crawford was blocking that exit, but toward the back of the station, where there was an emergency exit that led to the alley behind the building. As I ran, I could hear laughter behind me, not human laughter, but something that sounded like wind chimes made of bones. The emergency exit was locked, requiring a key that was kept in the office. I fumbled through Jake's desk, searching frantically while the inhuman laughter grew closer. Finally, I found the key ring and managed to get the door open. The alley behind the station was dark and narrow, filled with dumpsters and emergency equipment. I ran toward the street, hoping to find real police, real people, anyone who could help me make sense of what was happening. But as I reached the mouth of the alley, I stopped dead in my tracks. The street was full of vehicles. Not normal traffic, but the same impossible floating cars and trucks I'd seen in the station lot. They filled the road from sidewalk to sidewalk, all hovering silently about 3 feet off the ground. And in each one, a pale figure with black eyes was watching me. I turned to run back the way I'd come, but the alley was blocked now by more vehicles. I was surrounded, trapped in a narrow space between buildings with nowhere to go. The thing that had been wearing Officer Crawford's face emerged from the station's back door. It no longer bothered to maintain its human appearance. Its skin was translucent now, showing something dark and writhing underneath. Its eyes were holes in its skull, and its mouth opened to reveal rows of teeth that went deeper than any human throat should. "You can see us," it said, its voice now clearly coming from somewhere other than its throat. "That's unusual. Most humans can't perceive us directly. What do you want?" I asked, backing against the alley wall. "We don't want anything from you specifically," the creature replied. "We exist in the spaces between things. Between sleep and waking, between life and death, between real and unreal. Most people live their entire lives without ever glimpsing us, even when we're right next to them. Then why can I see you? Sometimes when someone spends enough time in the liminal spaces, working alone at night, living on the edges of normal human activity, they develop the ability to perceive what others cannot. It's not a gift, Marcus. It's a curse." As it spoke, more of the creatures emerged from the floating vehicles. They surrounded me in the alley, all of them wearing approximations of human form, but clearly something else entirely. Some looked like people I'd seen before, customers from the gas station, other police officers, even what appeared to be Jake Reeves. But they were all wrong in subtle ways, like photographs that had been slightly distorted. "What are you going to do to me?" I asked. "Nothing," the lead creature said. "You'll go back to your job, continue working your night shifts, and try to convince yourself that none of this was real. The cameras will continue to show nothing unusual. Other people will continue to see empty lots and normal customers, but you'll know better. Why? Why show yourselves to me? Because now you belong to the liminal space too. You'll spend the rest of your life questioning what's real and what isn't, wondering if the customers you serve are human or something else wearing human faces. Every night, you'll watch for vehicles that cameras can't see, listen for voices that recordings won't capture." The creature that looked like Officer Crawford stepped closer. "And occasionally, we'll visit you again, just to remind you that the boundary between your world and ours is thinner than most people imagine." I closed my eyes, hoping that when I opened them, the creatures would be gone and I'd find myself back in the station dealing with a normal night shift emergency. But when I looked again, they were still there, watching me with their impossible eyes. "Go back to work, Marcus," the lead creature said. "Your shift isn't over yet." When I opened my eyes again, I was standing behind the counter in the gas station. The emergency exit door was closed and locked, showing no sign that I'd ever opened it. The security cameras showed a normal, empty lot. There was no sign of Officer Crawford or his patrol car. According to the station's clock, it was 4:30 a.m. I had lost nearly 2 hours with no memory of how I'd gotten from the alley back to the counter. My phone showed several missed calls from the 911 dispatcher, who had presumably been trying to follow up on my call about floating vehicles. I called the police station and spoke to the desk sergeant, asking about Officer Crawford's visit to my location. There was no record of any officer being dispatched to the gas station that night. When I described Officer Crawford, the sergeant told me that Dennis Crawford had died in a car accident 3 years ago. The rest of my shift passed without incident. Normal customers buying gas, coffee, and snacks. No floating vehicles, no creatures wearing human faces. Just an ordinary night at a roadside gas station. But I knew it wasn't over. Over the following weeks, I began to notice things that other people couldn't see. Customers whose reflections didn't quite match their appearance. Security footage that showed empty spaces where I could clearly see people standing. Voices on the phone that seemed to echo from impossibly far away. Jake became increasingly concerned about my mental state. He arranged for me to see a psychiatrist, Dr. Sarah Mendez, who diagnosed me with stress-induced psychosis and prescribed antipsychotic medication. The drugs helped in a way. They made the visions less vivid, less frightening. But they never made them go away entirely. I tried to quit my job several times, But every place I applied for work during daylight hours would call back to tell me they'd found someone else. It was as if I was being forced to remain in the night shift, in the liminal space between day and night where the creatures lived. Dr. Mendez told me that my experiences were a manifestation of sleep deprivation and social isolation common among people who work alone overnight. She explained that the human brain, when deprived of normal social interaction and regular sleep patterns, can create elaborate hallucinations that feel completely real to the person experiencing them. Her explanation was logical, scientific, and completely rational. It accounted for every aspect of my experiences in terms of known psychological phenomena. I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that I was simply suffering from a treatable mental illness, but I knew better. The creatures visited me regularly now, always during the quiet hours between 2 and 4 a.m. when the station was empty and the highway was dark. They didn't threaten me or interfere with my work. They simply watched, sometimes talking among themselves in languages that hurt to hear, occasionally asking me questions about human behavior that I couldn't answer. I learned to function around them, to serve human customers, while being observed by inhuman entities that cameras couldn't record. I developed strategies for distinguishing between real people and the creatures wearing human faces. Real humans cast proper shadows. Their voices came from their throats rather than from somewhere else entirely, and they didn't know things. They shouldn't know about my personal life. The hardest part was the isolation. I couldn't share my experiences with anyone without being labeled as mentally ill. Jake remained supportive but concerned, urging me to continue therapy and take my medication regularly. Dr. Mendez continued to treat my hallucinations with a combination of drugs and cognitive behavioral therapy designed to help me distinguish between reality and fantasy. But how do you explain to someone that reality itself has multiple layers, and that most people live their entire lives seeing only the surface layer? How do you convince a psychiatrist that the medication isn't curing an illness, but merely dulling your perception of something that exists outside normal human experience? The answer, I learned, is that you don't. You smile, you take your pills. You attend your therapy sessions, and you pretend to be getting better. You let people believe that your grip on reality is improving when in fact, you're simply becoming better at hiding what you can see. 3 months after my first encounter with the creatures, I had what Dr. Mendez called a breakthrough in therapy. I told her that the hallucinations were becoming less frequent and less vivid, that I was starting to recognize them as products of my own mind rather than external realities. She was pleased with my progress and began talking about reducing my medication dosage. But the truth was, I was simply learning to live in 2 worlds simultaneously. During the day, I functioned as a normal person dealing with the aftermath of the stress-induced psychological episode. I went to therapy, took my medication, and convinced everyone around me that I was recovering from a mental health crisis. I worked alongside creatures that existed in the spaces between human perception and objective reality. I served customers who were sometimes human and sometimes something else wearing human form. I watched vehicles that cameras couldn't see and listened to conversations in languages that didn't exist in any human culture. The creatures seemed to approve of my adaptation to their presence. The one that had first appeared as Officer Crawford visited me regularly, and over time our interactions became almost conversational. It explained that they had existed alongside humanity for thousands of years, living in the liminal spaces that humans created but rarely explored. Every culture has stories about us, it told me one quiet Tuesday morning as I restocked the cigarette display. Spirits, demons, fairies, jinn, different names for the same phenomenon. We are what you might call interdimensional refugees, beings who exist primarily in the spaces between your reality and others. Why do you choose to interact with humans at all? I asked. We don't usually, but occasionally someone develops the ability to perceive us directly, and when that happens, They become a bridge between our world and yours. You're not the first human to experience this, Marcus, and you won't be the last. What happened to the others? The creature that had been Officer Crawford smiled its too wide smile. Some learn to live with it, as you have. They go about their normal lives while serving as unwilling ambassadors to our realm. Others become obsessed with proving our existence to the rest of humanity, which usually results in them being institutionalized or worse. And some choose to cross over entirely. They abandon their human lives and join us in the liminal spaces. It's not necessarily a better existence, but it's honest. No more pretending to be normal, no more medication to dull the perception of reality. I thought about that conversation for weeks afterward. The idea of abandoning my human life was both terrifying and oddly appealing. No more pretending to be mentally ill. No more lying to therapists and supervisors about what I could see. But it would also mean giving up any chance of a normal relationship, a family, a life in the daylight world where most humans lived. The decision was made for me 6 months later when Jake announced that corporate was shutting down our station. Gas prices had made the location unprofitable, and they were consolidating operations to larger stations along the interstate. I would be laid off, along with the rest of the night shift employees. My last night at the station was quiet, even by creature standards. They seemed to sense that something was ending, and they gathered around the lot in greater numbers than I'd ever seen before. Not just the regular visitors, but dozens of others, filling the air above the pumps with their impossible vehicles. As my shift ended and the sun began to rise, the creature that had been Officer Crawford approached me one final time. "This is the end of your time in this particular liminal space," it said, "but not the end of your ability to perceive us. Wherever you go, whatever job you take, you'll continue to see us in the quiet places where humans rarely look." "Will I ever be normal again?" I asked. "Normal is a relative concept, Marcus. You've seen behind the curtain of ordinary reality. That knowledge doesn't go away, even if you choose to ignore it." The creature paused, tilting its head in a gesture that would have been thoughtful if it had been human. "But I can offer you a choice," it continued. "You can take a job in the daylight world, surround yourself with people and activity, and try to drown out the perception of our realm with constant human interaction. Many bridges choose this path. They live reasonably normal lives, though. They're never quite comfortable in purely human spaces again. What's the other choice? You can come with us. Abandon your human identity entirely and exist fully in the liminal spaces. You'd gain a complete understanding of our realm, but you'd lose any connection to the human world. No going back, no visiting family or friends, no existence in the daylight reality." I looked around the gas station one last time, the counter, where I'd spent 8 years serving customers, the windows through which I'd watched normal traffic and impossible vehicles, the cameras that had recorded a completely different version of events than what I'd experienced. "I need time to think about it," I said. The creature nodded. "Take all the time you need. We'll find you when you're ready to choose." That was 18 months ago. I've been working a day shift at a busy truck stop outside of Reno ever since, surrounded by constant activity and human interaction, just as the creature suggested. The steady stream of customers and coworkers provides enough distraction that I can almost ignore the occasional glimpse of something inhuman in my peripheral vision. Dr. Mendez considers me a success story. My psychotic episodes have virtually disappeared, and I've been off medication for over a year. I've even started dating someone, a woman named Carol who works at the truck stop's restaurant. She's kind and patient and completely unaware that the man she's falling in love with can see things that exist outside of normal human reality. But the choice the creature offered me hasn't gone away. Every night when I try to sleep, I think about the possibility of crossing over entirely, of abandoning the exhausting pretense of normalcy and accepting what I've become. No more lying about my experiences. No more pretending that the glimpses of inhuman entities are just tricks of tired eyes. Some nights, when Carol is working late and I'm alone in my apartment, I can feel them calling to me from the liminal spaces. The creatures gather outside my windows, invisible to cameras and undetectable by any normal means, but as real to me as the furniture in my living room. Last week, I found myself standing at my window at 3 a.m., watching them arrange themselves in patterns that seemed almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. The creature that had been Officer Crawford stood directly below my window, looking up at me with those impossible black eyes. It didn't speak, but somehow I understood its message. The offer still stands. I'm writing this account partly as a record, partly as a warning, and partly because I need to put these experiences into words before I make my final decision. If you're reading this and you work alone at night, gas stations, convenience stores, security guard positions, overnight hospital shifts, pay attention to the subtle signs that not everything is as normal as it appears. Watch for customers whose reflections don't quite match their appearance. Listen for voices that seem to echo from farther away than the person speaking. Notice if your security cameras sometimes show different scenes than what you're witnessing with your own eyes. These could be signs that you're developing the ability to perceive the liminal spaces, the areas between normal reality and something else entirely. If you start experiencing these phenomena, don't ignore them and don't immediately assume you're having a mental health crisis. Yes, stress and sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, but not all unexplained experiences can be dismissed as psychological symptoms. Sometimes the human mind develops the ability to perceive layers of reality that most people never access. But be careful. The creatures that inhabit these spaces aren't necessarily hostile, but they're not human either. Their motivations and goals are often incomprehensible to us, and becoming aware of their existence comes with a price. Once you can see them, you can never go back to the comfortable ignorance that most humans enjoy. You'll spend the rest of your life questioning what's real, walking a tightrope between two different versions of reality. You'll have to choose between pretending to be normal while hiding your true experiences, or acknowledging what you've seen and risking being labeled as mentally ill. Some people handle this burden better than others. I've met a few others over the years, usually during chance encounters at rest stops or all-night diners, who carry the same look of someone who's seen too much. We recognize each other instinctively, though we rarely speak about our experiences directly. It's too dangerous, too likely to be overheard by the wrong people or misunderstood by those who lack the perception to understand. Dr. Chen, the therapist I saw briefly after leaving the gas station, told me about other patients who'd had similar experiences. Always people who worked alone at night, who spent years in the quiet hours when normal human activity is at its lowest ebb. Security guards, night janitors, radio DJs, emergency dispatchers, people whose jobs place them in the liminal spaces where the boundaries between realities are thinnest. She couldn't tell me specifics due to patient confidentiality, but she hinted that my experiences weren't unique. There was a pattern, she said, of certain individuals developing what she called anomalous perceptual experiences after extended exposure to isolated, nighttime environments. The medical explanation is that prolonged social isolation and disrupted circadian rhythms can cause the brain to create elaborate false perceptions to compensate for lack of normal sensory input. The brain fills in gaps with hallucinations that seem completely real to the person experiencing them. But medical explanations don't account for the consistency of details across different people's experiences. They don't explain why multiple individuals, unknown to each other, report seeing similar entities with similar characteristics. And they certainly don't explain the physical evidence that sometimes accompanies these location. There was no point in sharing information he wouldn't believe and couldn't use. Instead, I suggested he hire security guards in pairs, never leaving anyone alone on the property during overnight hours. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The liminal space that had formed around that location was permanent now, a thin spot in reality where the creatures could more easily manifest. Anyone with the right sensitivity would eventually perceive them, and those people would face the same choice I'd been given. That night, I dreamed about the gas station as it had been. I was working my usual shift, serving normal customers and restocking shelves. Everything was peaceful, routine, comfortable. In the dream, I'd never seen the floating vehicles or the entities with black eyes. I was just a normal person working a normal job, living an ordinary life. When I woke up, I felt a profound sense of loss for the simplicity I'd given up when I developed the ability to see beyond normal reality. There was a time when my biggest concerns were whether we had enough coffee for the night shift, and whether suspicious customers might be planning to rob the till. Problems with simple, human-scale solutions. Now I lived with the constant awareness that reality had layers most people never perceived, that entities existed alongside humanity, without most humans ever knowing they were there. It was a burden of knowledge that colored every interaction, every moment of supposed normalcy. Carol noticed my increasing distraction and mood changes. She suggested I see a counselor again, maybe consider medication for what she assumed was depression or anxiety. I appreciated her concern, but how could I explain that my emotional state wasn't the result of a chemical imbalance or psychological trauma, but of knowledge that I couldn't share with anyone? The hardest part was the isolation. Not physical isolation. I was surrounded by people at work, in my relationship with Carol, in the normal social interactions of daily life. But intellectual and spiritual isolation, the knowledge that I was seeing and understanding things that no one else could perceive or comprehend. Began researching others who'd had similar experiences, looking for accounts online, in books, in academic papers about anomalous phenomena. I found scattered reports dating back decades, sometimes centuries. Always the same pattern. Individuals who worked alone at night, developing the ability to perceive entities that existed outside normal human awareness. Most of these accounts were dismissed as folklore, psychological episodes, or outright fabrication. The few that were studied academically were approached from the assumption that they represented various forms of mental illness or cultural fantasy. No one seemed willing to consider the possibility that these experiences might represent genuine perception of phenomena that existed outside the normal human sensory range. But buried in the academic literature, I found hints that some researchers had taken these accounts more seriously. Papers on consciousness studies that mentioned anomalous perceptual states. Anthropological studies of night shift workers that noted unusually high rates of unusual experiences. Psychiatric research that acknowledged patterns in certain types of hallucinations that couldn't be fully explained by existing models of mental illness. None of these sources said outright that entities like the ones I'd encountered actually existed, but they suggested that the human capacity for perception might be broader and more complex than most people assumed, and that certain environmental conditions might activate perceptual abilities that remain dormant under normal circumstances. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that what I'd experienced was real, not in the sense that everyone could perceive it, but real in the sense that it represented genuine contact with entities that existed independently of human consciousness. This conclusion brought me back to the choice the creature had offered: continue living in the daylight world while hiding my true experiences, or cross over entirely into their realm. 6 months after leaving the gas station, I made my decision. I broke up with Carol, telling her I needed time to deal with personal issues. I quit my job at the truck stop, cashed out my retirement savings, and sold most of my possessions. I told people I was taking an extended solo trip to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. None of that was untrue, exactly. I was taking a trip, and I was trying to figure out my life. I just wasn't planning to come back. I drove to remote locations across the western United States, Places where the boundaries between normal reality and the liminal spaces were thinnest. Abandoned gas stations, closed rest stops, empty truck stops on forgotten highways. At each location, I waited for the creatures to appear, trying to understand their world better before making my final commitment to joining them. What I learned during those months of travel was that the liminal spaces weren't just random thin spots in reality. They formed around human activities that existed on the edges of normal society. Places where people worked alone, where social structures were minimal, where the usual human patterns of behavior were suspended. Night shift locations were particularly prone to liminal space formation, but so were other types of isolated human activity. Remote fire lookout towers, automated weather stations, unmanned radio transmitters, isolated research facilities. Anywhere humans created a minimal presence without full engagement with normal social reality, the creatures inhabited these spaces. Like hermit crabs inhabiting discarded shells. They didn't create the liminal areas, but they were drawn to them, perhaps because these spaces provided a bridge between their realm and ours. After 8 months of travel and research, I finally felt ready to make my choice. I returned to Nevada and drove to the original gas station location, now the used car lot, and waited for the creatures to appear. They came as the sun set, materializing out of the growing darkness with their impossible vehicles and their 2 human faces. The one that had been Officer Crawford approached me as I stood in the spot where Pump 3 used to be. "You've learned much during your travels," it said, its voice carrying that familiar echo from somewhere far away. "I've learned enough," I replied. "I'm ready to cross over." The creature tilted its head in that gesture that might have been thoughtful if it had been human. "Are you certain? Once you abandon your human identity, you can never return to the daylight world. No contact with family, no relationships with humans, no existence in normal reality." I thought about Carol, who probably still wondered why I'd suddenly ended our relationship and disappeared. I thought about my sister in Oregon, who sent worried emails asking when I was coming back from my trip. I thought about all the ordinary human experiences I'd be giving up: movies, restaurants, conversations about weather and sports and politics. But I also thought about the exhaustion of pretending to be normal while seeing things others couldn't see, the loneliness of carrying knowledge I couldn't share, the constant effort required to function in a world that only showed me its surface layer. "I'm certain," I said. The creature nodded. "Then welcome to the liminal spaces, Marcus Chun. Your human life ends here." I felt the change immediately. Not a physical transformation, exactly, but a shift in perception so profound that it felt like awakening from a dream I hadn't realized I was having. The used car lot around me flickered and revealed itself as something else entirely, a crossroads where multiple realities intersected, where beings from different layers of existence could meet and interact. I could see the creatures clearly, now not as approximations of human form, but as they actually were. Beings of shadow and possibility, entities that existed in the spaces between defined realities. They weren't hostile or benevolent in human terms. They simply were, as natural and inevitable as weather patterns or geological formations. My human concerns, relationships, career, social identity felt suddenly remote and unimportant. Not because they'd been taken from me, but because I could see them now as constructs of a single layer of reality, no more significant than the concerns of characters in a book. I existed now in the liminal spaces, able to perceive all the layers of reality simultaneously. I could see the used car lot as Rodriguez knew it, the gas station as I'd worked in it, and dozens of other configurations that the location had held or could hold. All equally real, all existing in the same space, but separated by the thinnest of barriers. The other creatures welcomed me as a new member of their community, though community wasn't quite the right word for what we became. We were more like a network of consciousness that shared the liminal spaces. each maintaining our individual awareness while participating in a larger understanding of the nature of reality. I learned that time worked differently in our realm. Minutes, hours, days, these were constructs of human consciousness that had no meaning for beings who existed outside normal temporal flow. Past, present, and future were simply different areas of the same infinite landscape, all equally accessible to those who knew how to navigate between them. I visited other gas stations, other convenience stores, other isolated night shift locations across the country, not traveling in the human sense, but shifting my perception to include these spaces in my immediate awareness. I watched other humans develop the ability to see beyond normal reality, faced with the same choice in the human world, learning to live with their expanded perception while maintaining their normal lives. Others, like me, chose to cross over entirely. A few became lost between the two realms, unable to fully commit to either human or liminal existence. I tried to guide those who were ready to understand, appearing to them as I had first seen the creatures, as approximations of familiar human forms that slowly revealed their true nature. I offered them the same choice I'd been given, respecting their decision whether they chose to stay or cross over, but I never forgot my human identity entirely. Even in the liminal spaces, I retained memories of Marcus Chun, the gas station clerk who'd worked alone for 8 years, before discovering that reality had more layers than most people ever imagined. This account, which I'm somehow able to transmit to the human world despite no longer existing within it, serves as both record and warning. For those who work alone in the quiet hours, who begin to notice that not everything is as normal as it appears, understand that you're approaching a threshold. You can turn back. You can request day shifts, find work that keeps you surrounded by people and activity, take medication to dull your expanding perception. Many people make this choice and live reasonably normal lives, though they're never quite comfortable in purely human spaces again. Or you can continue forward, accepting the knowledge that reality is far stranger and more complex than most humans realize. This path leads to understanding, but also to isolation from everything you've known as normal human existence. The choice, as always, is yours, but choose carefully. Once you see behind the curtain of ordinary reality, you can never completely unsee what you've discovered. The knowledge changes you, whether you choose to act on it or spend your life trying to ignore it. And remember, we're always watching from the liminal spaces, waiting for those who are ready to see us. We're not myths or hallucinations or symptoms of mental illness. We're as real as anything else in the vast layered complexity of existence. We're just living in the spaces between the things you think you know. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I've been a registered nurse for 12 years. I've worked in emergency rooms, intensive care units, and pediatric wards across 3 different states. I thought I'd seen every kind of medical emergency, every type of human suffering, every possible scenario that a hospital could present. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened during my last night shift at St. Mary's Medical Center in Bakersfield, California. It was March 23, 2024, and I was working the overnight shift in the ICU. St. Mary's was a mid-sized hospital that served the rural communities around Bakersfield, and the ICU was typically quiet during night hours. We had 16 beds, but on weeknights we rarely had more than 8 or 9 patients, most of them stable and requiring minimal intervention during the overnight hours. That night, I was working with Dr. Amanda Foster, a resident who'd been at St. Mary's for about 6 months, and Maria Santos, a nursing assistant who'd been with the hospital for over 20 years. It should have been a routine shift: check on patients every hour, administer medications as scheduled, respond to any emergency calls that came in. The first sign that something was wrong came around 1:30 a.m. when I noticed a nurse I didn't recognize making rounds in the ICU. She was a woman in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing scrubs that looked somehow different from our standard hospital uniforms. They were the right color, that distinctive teal that St. Mary's used, but the fabric looked older, more worn, like something that had been washed thousands of times. I approached her as she was checking on Mr. Patterson in bed 7, a 68-year-old man recovering from cardiac surgery. "Excuse me," I said quietly, not wanting to disturb the sleeping patient. "I don't think we've met. I'm Rebecca Martinez, charge nurse for tonight." The woman looked up at me and smiled, but her expression was somehow vacant, like she was looking through me rather than at me. "I'm Sarah," she said. "Sarah Williams, I'm covering the night shift." Asterisk. "That's strange," I replied. "I wasn't told we were getting additional coverage tonight. What unit are you normally assigned to?" Sarah continued adjusting Mr. Patterson's foreline with practiced efficiency. "Oh, I've been working nights here for years, since 1987 actually." That didn't make sense. I'd been at St. Mary's for 3 years, and I knew all the night shift nurses. There was no one named Sarah Williams on the roster, and certainly no one who'd been working there since 1987. The hospital had only been open since 1995. "Sarah, I think there might be some confusion about the scheduling," I said. "Let me check with nursing administration in the morning. For tonight, though, I need to verify your credentials, but when I turned back to continue the conversation, Sarah was gone. Not walking away down the hall, not stepping into another room, simply gone. Mr. Patterson was sleeping peacefully, his foreline properly adjusted, but there was no sign that anyone had been there. I looked around the ICU, thinking she might have moved to another patient's room, but the unit was quiet except for Maria, who was updating charts at the nurses' station. Dr. Foster was in the break room reviewing patient files. "Maria," I called out, "did you see where the other nurse went? The one who was checking on Mr. Patterson?" Maria looked up from her charts with confusion. "What other nurse?" "Rebecca, it's just you and me tonight, same as always." "No, there was a woman named Sarah Williams, dark hair, wearing our scrubs. She said she'd been working nights here since 1987. Maria's expression changed from confusion to concern. "Rebecca, honey, there's no Sarah Williams on our staff. And nobody's been working nights here since 1987. The hospital wasn't even built then." I knew Maria was right, but I also knew what I'd seen. I'd had a full conversation with someone who claimed to be a nurse, someone who knew how to properly adjust 4 lines and seemed familiar with our patients. Either I was having some kind of hallucination, or there was a nurse working in our ICU who didn't officially exist. I decided to check the security cameras. St. Mary's had a comprehensive surveillance system that covered all patient areas, and if there really had been an unauthorized person in the ICU, it would be recorded. The security office was located on the ground floor, and the night guard, Tom Rodriguez, was someone I'd worked with before during various emergency situations. Tom had been with the hospital for 8 years and knew the staff well. "Tom, I need to look at the ICU footage from about 20 minutes ago," I told him. "I think we might have had an unauthorized person in the unit." "Sure thing, Rebecca. What time frame are we looking at?" "Around 1:30 a.m., bed 7. Tom pulled up the footage on his monitor, and we watched the recorded video together. What we saw made my stomach drop. The camera showed me walking toward bed 7 and stopping next to Mr. Patterson. On the recording, I appeared to be having a conversation with someone, but there was no one there. I could be seen listening, responding, even stepping aside as if making room for another person. But the cameras showed only empty space. Asterisk. "Rebecca," Tom said carefully, "who were you talking to?" I stared at the monitor, unable to process what I was seeing. The video clearly showed me having a full conversation with someone who wasn't there, adjusting my position to accommodate a person who didn't exist, responding to comments from someone. The cameras couldn't see I was talking to another nurse, I said weakly. Sarah Williams, she was right there, checking on the patient. Tom rewound the footage and played it again. Same result. According to the security cameras, I had been alone in the ICU the entire time, talking to myself and acting as if someone else was present. Maybe you should take a break, Tom suggested gently. Night shifts can be rough, especially when you've been working a lot of overtime. I returned to the ICU feeling shaken and confused. Had I really imagined the entire encounter? It seemed impossible. The conversation had been so real, so detailed. Sarah Williams had seemed as solid and present as any person I'd ever interacted with, but the security footage didn't lie. Either the cameras had somehow failed to record Sarah Williams, or I was experiencing hallucinations so vivid that I couldn't distinguish them from reality. I tried to focus on my normal duties, checking on patients and updating their charts. But around 3 a.m., I saw her again. This time, Sarah was in bed 12, adjusting the ventilator settings for Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who'd been admitted with respiratory failure. I watched from the nurse's station as Sarah worked with obvious expertise, checking the machine's readouts and making small adjustments that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. I approached slowly, determined to get a better understanding of what was happening. Sarah, I called out as I walked toward bed 12. We need to talk. She looked up from the ventilator with that same vacant smile. Of course, Rebecca. What do you need? I need to understand who you are and why you're here. I checked with security, and there's no record of you entering the hospital tonight. I've looked at the staff roster, and there's no Sarah Williams employed here. Sarah continued her work on the ventilator, her hands moving with practiced precision. I've been working here longer than most people remember. Sometimes the paperwork gets confused, especially for those of us who've been here since 1995. How could you have been working here since 1987? Sarah paused in her work and looked at me with those strangely empty eyes. Time works differently for some of us, Rebecca. We don't always follow the same schedules as everyone else. Before I could ask what she meant, Dr. Foster appeared at the foot of Mrs. Chun's bed. Rebecca, is everything all right? You've been standing here for several minutes without saying anything. I turned to Dr. Foster, then back to where Sarah had been working. The space next to the ventilator was empty. Sarah Williams had vanished again, but the ventilator settings had been adjusted, and Mrs. Chun's vital signs were improved. Amanda, did you see the nurse who was just here? The one adjusting Mrs. Chun's ventilator? Dr. Foster looked confused. What nurse? Rebecca, you've been standing here alone the whole time I've been watching. And Mrs. Chun's ventilator settings haven't been changed since the respiratory therapist left at midnight. But that wasn't true. I could see that the settings had been modified, and Mrs. Chun's oxygen saturation was better than it had been an hour ago. Someone had adjusted the machine, and it wasn't Dr. Foster or me or anyone else who was supposed to be in the ICU that night. I excused myself and went to the break room, trying to make sense of what was happening. 2 encounters with a nurse who didn't exist, both resulting in improved patient care, but no record on security cameras and no memory from other staff members. I called my supervisor, Janet Morrison, even though it was the middle of the night. Janet had been the ICU director for 15 years and knew everything that happened in the unit. Janet, it's Rebecca. I'm sorry to call so late, but I need to ask you about a nurse named Sarah Williams. Sarah Williams? Janet's voice was groggy but alert. Rebecca, what's wrong? Are you having problems on your shift? I keep seeing a nurse who claims to work here, but she's not on our roster and security has no record of her. She says she's been working nights since 1987. There was a long pause before Janet responded. Rebecca, I need you to listen to me carefully. There was a nurse named Sarah Williams who worked at the old Bakersfield Community Hospital before St. Mary's was built. She died in a car accident in 1987, the same year the old hospital was demolished. My blood went cold. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you're seeing someone who claims to be Sarah Williams, and she says she's been working since 1987, you're either having a psychological episode, or you're encountering something that can't be explained medically. Janet paused again, and I could hear her moving around, probably getting dressed to come to the hospital. I'm coming in, she said. Don't do anything until I get there. And Rebecca? Don't approach this Sarah Williams again. If what you're seeing is what I think it is, it could be dangerous. After hanging up with Janet, I tried to research Sarah Williams online. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Sarah Williams had indeed been a registered nurse at Bakersfield Community Hospital. She had worked the night shift in their intensive care unit for 3 years before dying in a car accident on March 23, 1987. Today was March 23, 2024, exactly 37 years after her death. The articles about her accident described her as a dedicated nurse who had been driving home from her night shift when she was struck by a drunk driver. She had been just 32 years old, with a reputation for exceptional patient care and a particular talent for working with critically ill patients during overnight hours. But what disturbed me most was a detail mentioned in one of the obituaries. Sarah Williams had been known for her ability to improve patients' conditions through small adjustments and careful monitoring that other nurses sometimes missed. She had an intuitive understanding of critical care that had saved numerous lives during her short career. Janet arrived at the hospital around 4:30 a.m., and I met her in the ICU to explain what had been happening. She listened to my account with growing concern, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never dismissing my experiences as hallucinations. This isn't the first time something like this has happened at St. Mary's, she told me after I'd finished explaining. We've had reports over the years of nurses seeing someone who matches Sarah Williams' description. Always during night shifts, always in the ICU, and always when we're short-staffed or dealing with particularly critical patients. Why haven't I heard about this before? Because hospital administration doesn't want it getting out. It's bad for public relations if people think the hospital is haunted. But the staff who've been here for a long time, we know. We've seen things that can't be explained medically. Janet walked with me to check on the patients Sarah had interacted with. Mr. Patterson's recovery from surgery was progressing faster than expected, and Mrs. Chun's respiratory function had improved significantly during the night shift. Her patient outcomes were always exceptional, Janet murmured as she reviewed Mrs. Chun's chart. Even in death, it seems like she's still trying to help. Around 5:30 a.m., as the night shift was nearing its end, I saw Sarah Williams one final time. She was standing at the nurse's station, writing in a patient chart with the same careful handwriting I'd seen nurses use for decades. When she noticed me watching, she looked up and smiled that vacant smile. "Your shift is almost over," she said. "You should go home and rest. Are you really Sarah Williams?" I asked. "The nurse who died in 1987? Sarah set down her pen and looked at me with an expression that seemed almost sad. I never finished my shift that night. I was driving home when the accident happened, but my patients still needed care. So I came back. You've been working here for 37 years? Time doesn't work the same way when you're not really alive anymore. It feels like I just clocked in yesterday, but I've been watching over patients here since the hospital opened, making sure they get the care they need during the quiet hours." I looked at the chart she'd been writing in. It was for bed 14, a patient we'd admitted that evening with severe pneumonia. According to Sarah's notes, the patient's condition was deteriorating and would require immediate intervention. "How do you know that?" I asked. "We haven't seen any signs of decline." "You will," Sarah said simply. "In about 10 minutes, his oxygen saturation will drop and he'll go into respiratory distress. You'll need to call Dr. Foster and increase his oxygen flow to 15 liters per minute." As she spoke, the monitor for bed 14 began alarming. The patient's vital signs were changing rapidly, exactly as Sarah had predicted. I ran to the room and found the patient struggling to breathe, his oxygen levels dropping dangerously low. "Dr. Foster," I called out. "I need you in bed 14 right now." By the time Dr. Foster arrived and we'd stabilized the patient, Sarah Williams was gone again. But her notes in the chart were still there, written in clear handwriting that documented the patient's condition changes before they had occurred. Dr. Foster read the notes with confusion. "Rebecca, when did you write these notes?" "They're time-stamped for 5:30, but they describe symptoms that just started happening." "I didn't write them," I said. "Sarah Williams did." Dr. Foster looked at me with concern. "Rebecca, you wrote these notes. This is your handwriting. And there's no Sarah Williams working here." I looked at the chart again. Dr. Foster was right. The handwriting looked like mine, even though I was certain I hadn't written those notes. Either Sarah Williams could perfectly mimic my handwriting, or something even stranger was happening. Janet stayed with me until the day shift arrived at 7 a.m. As I was preparing to leave, she pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you feel like you're losing your grip on reality? Are you having trouble distinguishing between what's real and what might be psychological episodes?" I thought about her question carefully. The encounters with Sarah Williams had been vivid and detailed, but they left no objective evidence except for improved patient outcomes and notes that appeared to be in my own handwriting. "I don't know," I admitted. "Everything I experienced felt completely real, but the security footage and other people's memories suggest otherwise. Either I'm having very elaborate hallucinations, or something supernatural is happening that cameras can't record." Janet nodded. "I'm going to recommend that you take some time off. Not because I think you're losing your mind, but because encounters with Sarah Williams seem to happen to nurses who are under a lot of stress. Maybe some rest will help you process this experience." I took Janet's advice and requested a week of personal leave. During that time, I researched everything I could find about Sarah Williams and similar experiences at other hospitals. What I discovered was both fascinating and troubling. Hospitals, it turned out, were common locations for paranormal encounters. The combination of emotional intensity, life and death situations, and overnight hours created conditions where the boundary between life and death seemed thinner than in other environments. But Sarah Williams wasn't described as a typical ghost or spirit. The encounters reported by other nurses over the years painted a picture of someone who was still actively working, still dedicated to patient care, still following the same professional protocols she'd used when the ICU was understaffed or when patients required care that exceeded the normal capabilities of the night shift. Her interventions were always medically appropriate and often prevented serious complications or deaths. When I returned to work a week later, Janet had arranged for me to work day shifts for a while. But I couldn't stop thinking about my encounters with Sarah Williams and what they might mean. 3 months later, I volunteered to work a night shift to cover for a colleague who was sick. It was a quiet Tuesday night in June, and the ICU had only 6 patients, all of them stable, around 2 a.m. We admitted a critical patient from the emergency room, a 40-year-old man who'd suffered a massive heart attack. His condition was extremely unstable, and Dr. Foster was concerned that he might not survive the night. As I was setting up the monitoring equipment, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Sarah Williams standing at the foot of the bed, studying the patient's chart with professional intensity. "He's going to need a different medication protocol," she said without looking up. "The standard cardiac drugs won't be enough for his particular condition." This time, I didn't question her presence or demand explanations. Instead, I asked, "What do you recommend?" Sarah described a specific combination of medications that was different from what Dr. Foster had ordered. Her recommendations were complex and detailed, requiring precise timing and careful monitoring. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. Dr. Foster followed standard protocols. Standard protocols don't account for his underlying genetic condition, Sarah replied. He has a rare enzyme deficiency that affects how his body processes cardiac medications. The standard treatment will actually make his condition worse. I had no way to verify what Sarah was telling me, but her knowledge seemed both specific and authentic. I made the decision to call Dr. Foster and suggest the alternative medication protocol. Rebecca, where did you get this information? Dr. Foster asked after I'd explained Sarah's recommendations. These aren't standard treatments for cardiac patients. One researched some unusual cardiac conditions and thought this might apply to our patient's symptoms. Dr. Foster was skeptical, but the patient's condition was deteriorating rapidly with the standard treatment. She agreed to try Sarah's protocol, and within an hour, the patient's vital signs had stabilized significantly. This is remarkable, Dr. Foster said as she reviewed the patient's improved condition. How did you know to suggest this particular protocol? I've never seen it used for this type of cardiac event. I couldn't tell her that a nurse who'd been dead for 37 years had provided the medical advice. Instead, I said I'd been reading about unusual cardiac conditions and had made an educated guess, but the experience confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Sarah Williams wasn't just a ghost or hallucination. She was somehow still practicing medicine, still using her knowledge and skills to help patients who needed care beyond what normal medical protocols could provide. Over the following months, I began to see Sarah more regularly during night shifts. She never stayed long, never engaged in extended conversations, but she appeared whenever patients needed the kind of intuitive, experienced care that she'd been known for when she was alive. Other nurses began to notice my improved patient outcomes during night shifts, and several colleagues asked how I'd developed such good instincts for critical care. I couldn't explain that I was receiving guidance from someone who'd been perfecting her skills for over 3 decades after her death. Dr. Foster recommended me for a promotion to night shift supervisor, citing my exceptional patient care and ability to anticipate medical complications before they became critical. I accepted the position, knowing that it would give me more opportunities to work with Sarah and learn from her accumulated knowledge. The promotion came with access to historical hospital records, and I used this access to research Sarah Williams' actual nursing career. What I found painted a picture of someone who'd been extraordinarily dedicated to her profession. Sarah had worked exclusively night shifts because she believed that patients needed the most skilled care during overnight hours when fewer staff members were available. She had developed innovative protocols for monitoring critical patients and had saved dozens of lives through early detection of complications. Her supervisor's notes from 1987 described her as an exceptional nurse with an almost supernatural ability to anticipate patient needs. She had been scheduled for promotion to night shift supervisor the week after her fatal car accident. Reading these records, I began to understand why Sarah had returned. She hadn't finished the work she'd been called to do, and death hadn't released her from the commitment she'd made to patient care. But I also began to understand the personal cost of working so closely with someone who existed between life and death. The constant awareness that I was interacting with someone who wasn't technically alive affected my relationships with live-in colleagues and friends. I found myself preferring night shifts to day shifts, not just because of the work environment, but because night shifts felt more real to me. The daylight world of normal human interaction began to feel superficial compared to the profound experiences I was having during overnight hours. Dr. Foster noticed the change in my behavior and recommended that I see a counselor. She was concerned that I was becoming too isolated, too focused on work to maintain healthy relationships outside the hospital. The counselor, Dr. Michael Chen, was experienced in treating healthcare workers who develop psychological issues related to their high-stress jobs. But when I tried to explain my experiences with Sarah Williams, He focused on stress-induced hallucinations and encouraged me to consider medication. Night shift work can disrupt normal brain chemistry, he explained. Combined with the emotional intensity of critical care nursing, it's not uncommon for healthcare workers to experience vivid hallucinations that feel completely real. I tried to follow Dr. Chun's advice, taking medication to reduce anxiety and hallucinations. But the drugs didn't make Sarah Williams disappear. They just made it harder for me to communicate with her effectively, which resulted in poorer patient outcomes and increased stress. After 3 months, I stopped taking the medication and told Dr. Chun that the hallucinations had stopped. It was easier to lie about my experiences than to continue fighting for recognition of something that couldn't be proven medically. But my relationship with Sarah Williams continued to deepen. She began sharing knowledge that went beyond specific medical protocols, teaching me about the nature of consciousness, the connection between emotional states and physical healing, and the ways that human awareness could extend beyond normal sensory perception. Death isn't an ending, she told me one night as we worked together to stabilize a patient who'd suffered a stroke. It's a transition to a different type of existence. Some people move on completely, but others maintain connections to the physical world through their commitments and relationships. Asterisk, is that why you're still here? Because of your commitment to nursing? Partly, Sarah replied. But also because patients need advocates during the vulnerable hours when they're closest to death themselves. Night shift nurses serve as guides for people who are navigating the boundary between life and whatever comes after. This conversation helped me understand why I'd been chosen to see Sarah Williams. My work as a night shift nurse placed me in the same liminal space she inhabited. The area between normal waking consciousness and the deeper states that people experienced during critical illness or near-death situations. But it also made me realize that I was changing in ways that might eventually separate me from normal human existence. The more time I spent working with Sarah, the more I could perceive things that other people couldn't see or understand. Began to notice other entities in the hospital, not nurses like Sarah, but beings that seemed to be drawn to places where people died or came close to death. Some appeared to be helping patients transition peacefully, while others seemed to be waiting for opportunities to influence the boundary between life and death. The hospital chaplain, Father Rodriguez, noticed my increasing awareness of these phenomena. He approached me one night after observing me having what appeared to be a conversation with empty air. "Rebecca, I've been watching you, and I think you're seeing things that most people can't perceive. Is that correct?" I was surprised by his directness, but relieved to talk to someone who might understand. "Yes, Father. I see beings that help patients during critical moments. And one nurse who died in 1987 but continues to work night shifts." Father Rodriguez nodded as if this was completely normal. "Hospitals are thin places, Rebecca. The boundary between physical and spiritual reality is weaker here because of all the intense emotions and life and death situations. Some people develop the ability to perceive spiritual entities, especially if they work in these environments for extended periods." "Is it dangerous?" "It can be," he replied honestly. "The ability to perceive spiritual entities often comes with the risk of becoming too detached from normal human reality. You need to maintain connections to the living world, or you might find yourself drawn too deeply." His warning proved prophetic. Over the following months, I found it increasingly difficult to relate to people who couldn't perceive the spiritual dimensions of the hospital environment. My relationships with colleagues became strained, and I lost touch with friends outside the medical field. Was becoming more like Sarah Williams, technically alive but existing primarily in the liminal space between normal reality and whatever lay beyond it. The situation reached a crisis point when I began to see patients who had died years earlier returning to visit the ICU. Not like Sarah, who was actively working, but as observers who seemed to be checking on the continuing care. being provided to living patients. These encounters were different from my interactions with Sarah Williams. The visiting spirits didn't communicate directly or provide medical guidance. They simply watched, sometimes showing approval or concern about the treatment. Current patients were receiving. Dr. Foster noticed that I was frequently distracted during shifts, appearing to watch empty spaces or listen to conversations that no one else could hear. She recommended another psychological evaluation, this time with a psychiatrist who specialized in work-related psychological disorders. Dr. Lisa Wong was more perceptive than the previous counselor. Instead of immediately diagnosing hallucinations, she asked detailed questions about my experiences and their impact on my work performance and patient outcomes. "Rebecca, your patient care metrics are exceptional," she said after reviewing my performance records. "Your ability to anticipate complications and provide appropriate interventions is statistically significant. Whether your perceptions represent actual spiritual encounters or are manifestations of highly developed intuitive abilities, they seem to be helping you provide better care. So you don't think I'm losing my mind? I think you're experiencing something that our current medical understanding can't fully explain. The question isn't whether your perceptions are real in an objective sense, but whether they're helping or harming your ability to function as a healthcare provider and as a human being." Dr. Wong's approach was refreshing, but it didn't resolve the fundamental challenge I was facing. My ability to perceive spiritual entities was making me an exceptional nurse, but it was also isolating me from normal human relationships and experiences. The decision point came during a night shift in December 2024, 9 months after my first encounter with Sarah Williams. We had admitted a young mother who'd suffered complications during childbirth and was not expected to survive the night. As I monitored her condition, Sarah Williams appeared with several other entities I'd never seen before. They surrounded the patient's bed, and I could sense that they were preparing to guide her through the transition from life to death. "She's not ready to go," I said to Sarah. "She has a newborn baby who needs her." Sarah looked at me with an expression that was both compassionate and sad. "It's not our decision to make, Rebecca. We can provide comfort and guidance, but we can't change the fundamental course of life and death. But you've helped me save other patients. You've provided medical knowledge that prevented deaths. I've helped you provide better care to patients who were meant to recover," Sarah replied. "This woman's injuries are too severe. Her body is shutting down, and no medical intervention can reverse the process." As we spoke, the patient's vital signs began to fail. Her blood pressure dropped, her heart rate became irregular, and her breathing became labored. The monitors were alarming, but I knew that calling Dr. Foster wouldn't make any difference. Instead, I focused on providing comfort care, adjusting the patient's position, and speaking softly to her even though she was unconscious. Sarah Williams and the other entities remained at the bedside, and I could sense their presence helping to ease the woman's transition. The patient died peacefully at 4:17 a.m., surrounded by spiritual guardians that only I could perceive. Her death was inevitable given her injuries, but the process was gentler and more dignified than it might have been otherwise. After completing the necessary paperwork and notifying the family, I realized that I had reached a crossroads similar to the one I'd heard described by patients who'd had near-death experiences. I could continue working as a living nurse with the ability to perceive spiritual entities, or I could cross over entirely into the realm where Sarah Williams existed. Choice became clearer over the following weeks as I found it increasingly difficult to function in the normal world. My perceptions of spiritual entities were becoming so vivid that I sometimes couldn't distinguish between living patients and visiting spirits. I was making clinical decisions based on guidance from entities that other staff members couldn't see or verify. Dr. Foster called me into her office in early January 2025 to discuss my performance. She was concerned that I was showing signs of severe psychological stress and was considering recommending medical leave. "Rebecca, your patient outcomes are still excellent, but your behavior is becoming increasingly erratic. Other staff members have reported that you frequently talk to empty spaces and make clinical decisions based on information that you can't explain or document. What if I told you that I was receiving guidance from a nurse who died in 1987, but continues to work night shifts in this ICU?" Dr. Foster looked at me with genuine concern. "I'd say that you need immediate psychiatric evaluation and probably hospitalization. Rebecca, you're describing symptoms of psychosis, and it's affecting your ability to practice medicine safely." I realized that I had reached the point where I could no longer maintain my existence in both worlds. Either I had to abandon my ability to perceive spiritual entities and return to conventional nursing practice, or I had to accept that I was becoming something other than a normal living human being. That night I had my final conversation with Sarah Williams. She appeared as I was completing my last official shift at St. Mary's, looking as solid and present as she had during our first encounter 10 months earlier. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "I can't continue like this," I replied. "I'm losing my ability to function in the normal world, and it's affecting my work." Sarah nodded with understanding. "The same thing happened to me, except that I died before I had to make the choice. But you're facing the decision that I might have faced if I'd lived longer. What do you think I should do? You could take medication, see psychiatrists, and try to suppress your ability to perceive our realm. Some people manage to live relatively normal lives that way, though they're never quite comfortable in purely human spaces again. What's the other option?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time, her expression seemed genuinely warm rather than vacant. "You could join us. Not through death, but through a conscious choice to exist primarily in the liminal space between life and whatever comes after. You'd continue to help patients during their most vulnerable moments, but you'd give up most connections to normal human existence." I looked around the ICU one final time, the monitors and machines that had been the focus of my professional life, the beds where I'd watched people fight for their lives, the windows that looked out onto a world I was finding increasingly difficult to relate to. If I choose to cross over, what happens to my life? My apartment, my relationships, my identity as Rebecca Martinez? Those become less important as you develop a different understanding of identity and purpose. You'd still be yourself, but your sense of self would expand beyond individual human consciousness. I spent my remaining hour of the shift considering the choice. By the time 7 a.m. arrived and the day shift took over, I had made my decision. Submitted my resignation to Dr. Foster, telling her I was leaving nursing to pursue other interests. I settled my affairs, ended my lease, and gradually disconnected from the relationships and responsibilities that had defined my life as a living human being. March 23, 2025, exactly 1 year after my first encounter with Sarah Williams, I returned to St. Mary's during the night shift. Not as an employee, but as someone crossing over into the liminal space where dedicated healthcare providers continued their work beyond the boundaries of normal life and death. Asterisk. Father Rodriguez's warning proved prophetic. Over the following months, I found it increasingly difficult to relate to people who couldn't perceive the spiritual dimensions of the hospital environment. My relationships with colleagues became strained, and I lost touch with friends outside the medical field. Was becoming more like Sarah Williams, technically alive but existing primarily in the liminal space between normal reality and whatever lay beyond it. The situation reached a crisis point when I began to see patients who had died years earlier returning to visit the ICU, not like Sarah, who was actively working, but as observers who seemed to be checking on the continuing care being provided to living patients. These encounters were different from my interactions with Sarah Williams. The visiting spirits didn't communicate directly or provide medical guidance. They simply watched, sometimes showing approval or concern about the
Dr.
treatment
Foster
current
noticed
patients
that
that
I
I
was
was
receiving.
frequently distracted during shifts, appearing to watch empty spaces or listen to conversations that no one else could hear. She recommended another psychological evaluation, this time with a psychiatrist who specialized in work-related psychological disorders. Dr. Lisa Wong was more perceptive than the previous counselor. Instead of immediately diagnosing hallucinations, she asked detailed questions about my experiences and their impact on my work performance and patient outcomes. "Rebecca, your patient care metrics are exceptional," she said after reviewing my performance records. "Your ability to anticipate complications and provide appropriate interventions is statistically significant. Whether your perceptions represent actual spiritual encounters or manifestations of highly developed intuitive abilities, they seem to be helping you provide better care. So you don't think I'm losing my mind? I think you're experiencing something that our current medical understanding can't fully explain. The question isn't whether your perceptions are real in an objective sense, but whether they're helping or harming your ability to function as a healthcare provider and as a human being." Dr. Wong's approach was refreshing, but it didn't resolve the fundamental challenge I was facing. My ability to perceive spiritual entities was making me an exceptional nurse, but it was also isolating me from normal human relationships and experiences. The decision point came during a night shift in December 2024, 9 months after my first encounter with Sarah Williams. We had admitted a young mother who'd suffered complications during childbirth and was not expected to survive the night. As I monitored her condition, Sarah Williams appeared with several other entities I'd never seen before. They surrounded the patient's bed, and I could sense that they were preparing to guide her through the transition from life to death. "She's not ready to go," I said to Sarah. "She has a newborn baby who needs her." Sarah looked at me with an expression that was both compassionate and sad. "It's not our decision to make, Rebecca. We can provide comfort and guidance, but we can't change the fundamental course of life and death. But you've helped me save other patients. You've provided medical knowledge that prevented deaths. I've helped you provide better care to patients who were meant to recover," Sarah replied. "This woman's injuries are too severe. Her body is shutting down, and no medical intervention can reverse the process." As we spoke, the patient's vital signs began to fail. Her blood pressure dropped. Her heart rate became irregular, and her breathing became labored. The monitors were alarming, but I knew that calling Dr. Foster wouldn't make any difference. Instead, I focused on providing comfort care, adjusting the patient's position and speaking softly to her even though she was unconscious. Sarah Williams and the other entities remained at the bedside, and I could sense their presence helping to ease the woman's transition. The patient died peacefully at 4:17 a.m., surrounded by spiritual guardians that only I could perceive. Her death was inevitable given her injuries, but the process was gentler and more dignified than it might have been otherwise. After completing the necessary paperwork and notifying the family, I realized that I had reached a crossroads similar to the one I'd heard described by patients who'd had near-death experiences. I could continue working as a living nurse with the ability to perceive spiritual entities, or I could cross over entirely into the realm where Sarah Williams existed. Choice became clearer over the following weeks as I found it increasingly difficult to function in the normal world. My perceptions of spiritual entities were becoming so vivid that I sometimes couldn't distinguish between living patients and visiting spirits. I was making clinical decisions based on guidance from entities that other staff members couldn't see or verify. Dr. Foster called me into her office in early January 2025 to discuss my performance. She was concerned that I was showing signs of severe psychological stress and was considering recommending medical leave. "Rebecca, your patient outcomes are still excellent, but your behavior is becoming increasingly erratic. Other staff members have reported that you frequently talk to empty spaces and make clinical decisions based on information that you can't explain or document. What if I told you that I was receiving guidance from a nurse who died in 1987 but continues to work? Night shifts in this ICU? Dr. Foster looked at me with genuine concern. I'd say that you need immediate psychiatric evaluation and probably hospitalization. Rebecca, you're describing symptoms of psychosis, and it's affecting your ability to practice medicine safely. I realized that I had reached the point where I could no longer maintain my existence in both worlds. Either I had to abandon my ability to perceive spiritual entities and return to conventional nursing practice, or I had to accept that I was becoming something other than a normal living human being. That night, I had my final conversation with Sarah Williams. She appeared as I was completing my last official shift at St. Mary's, looking as solid and present as she had during our first encounter 10 months earlier. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "I can't continue like this," I replied. "I'm losing my ability to function in the normal world, and it's affecting my work." Sarah nodded with understanding. "The same thing happened to me, except that I died before I had to make the choice. But you're facing the decision that I might have faced if I'd lived longer. What do you think I should do? You could take medication, see psychiatrists, and try to suppress your ability to perceive our realm. Some people manage to live relatively normal lives that way, though they're never quite comfortable in purely human spaces again. What's the other option?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time, her expression seemed genuinely warm rather than vacant. "You could join us. Not through death, but through a conscious choice to exist primarily in the liminal space between life and whatever comes after. You'd continue to help patients during their most vulnerable moments, but you'd give up most connections to normal human existence." I looked around the ICU one final time. The monitors and machines that had been the focus of my professional life, the beds where I'd watched people fight for their lives, the windows that looked out onto a world I was finding increasingly difficult to relate to. If I choose to cross over, what happens to my life? My apartment, my relationships, my identity as Rebecca Martinez? Those become less important as you develop a different understanding of identity and purpose. You'd still be yourself, but your sense of self would expand beyond individual human consciousness. I spent my remaining hour of the shift considering the choice. By the time 7 a.m. arrived and the day shift took over, I had made my decision. Submitted my resignation to Dr. Foster, telling her I was leaving nursing to pursue other interests. I settled my affairs, ended my lease, and gradually disconnected from the relationships and responsibilities that had defined my life as a living human being. March 23, 2025, exactly 1 year after my first encounter with Sarah Williams. I returned to St. Mary's during the night shift, not as an employee, but as someone crossing over into the liminal space where dedicated healthcare providers continued their work beyond the boundaries of normal life and death. Sarah Williams was waiting for me in the ICU, along with other entities I'd glimpsed during my months of transition. They welcomed me into a community of consciousness that existed to provide care and guidance to patients during the vulnerable hours, when they were closest to crossing the boundary themselves. I learned that there were others like us in hospitals across the country, healthcare workers who had chosen to continue their service beyond the normal limits of human existence. We formed a network of spiritual care providers who could intervene in situations where conventional medicine wasn't sufficient. My human life as Rebecca Martinez ended that night, but my purpose as a healthcare provider expanded beyond anything I'd previously imagined. I could now perceive the full spectrum of patient needs, physical, emotional, and spiritual, and provide the kind of comprehensive care that could help people heal on multiple levels. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen to return to normal human existence, taken medication to suppress my perceptions, and continued practicing conventional nursing. I might have had a family, a retirement, a normal progression through the stages of human life. but I know I made the right choice. The work we do in the liminal spaces is essential, providing care and guidance that the living world can't offer. Patients facing critical illness or approaching death need advocates who understand both medical science and the spiritual dimensions of healing. If you're a healthcare worker who begins to notice things that others can't see, pay attention to what your expanding perception might be trying to tell you. Not all unusual experiences represent mental illness. Sometimes they represent an invitation to serve at a deeper level than conventional medicine allows. But choose carefully. Once you cross over into the liminal spaces, you can never fully return to normal human existence. The knowledge and abilities you gain come with the sacrifice of everything you've known, as always ready to help those who are called to join us in this expanded form of service. The boundary between life and death isn't an ending. It's a doorway to deeper understanding and more profound ways of helping others. My name is Detective Lisa Chun, and I've been investigating missing persons cases for the California State Police for 14 years. In that time, I've seen every type of disappearance imaginable: runaways, kidnappings, accidents, suicides, and the occasional case where someone simply chooses to vanish and start a new life. But the case of David Kowalski, a long-haul trucker, who disappeared for 72 hours and returned with no memory of where he'd been, remains the most disturbing investigation of my career. The case began on September 15, 2023, when David's wife, Maria Kowalski, called to report that her husband was missing. David was an experienced trucker who'd been driving cross-country routes for 18 years. He was scheduled to deliver a load of electronics from Los Angeles to a distribution center in Atlanta, a trip he'd made dozens of times before. According to Maria, David had called her from a truck stop in Barstow, California, on September 12th at approximately 10:30 p.m. He told her he was making good time and expected to reach his delivery destination on schedule. That was the last contact anyone had with David until he was found 3 days later sitting in his truck at the same Barstow truck stop, with no memory of the intervening time and no explanation for how he'd gotten there. When the missing person report was filed, I was assigned to the case because of my experience with transportation-related disappearances. Interstate trucking presents unique challenges for missing person investigations due to the vast distances involved and the relative isolation of drivers during long hauls. I drove to Barstow to interview the truck stop employees and review security footage from the nights in question. The Desert Oasis truck stop was a large 24-hour facility that catered to long-haul drivers with fuel, food, showers, and parking for several dozen trucks. It was the kind of place where drivers could blend into the crowd, and unusual behavior might not be noticed unless it was particularly disruptive. The night manager, Steve Rodriguez, remembered David's truck being in the lot on September 12th. Big Peterbilt blue cab, pulling a white trailer, he told me. Driver seemed normal when he came in for coffee and a sandwich around 10 o'clock. Paid cash. Didn't cause any problems. But when I asked about David's departure, Steve couldn't provide specific details. Trucks come and go all night, he explained. Unless there's a problem or someone pays with a credit card, I don't usually track individual departures. The security footage was more helpful but also more confusing. The cameras clearly showed David's truck arriving at 9:47 p.m. on September 12th and David himself entering the truck stop building at 10:03 p.m. He appeared normal and relaxed, moving with the casual confidence of an experienced driver who was familiar with truck stop routines, but the footage of his departure was strange. According to the timestamps, David returned to his truck at 10:31 p.m. and drove away at 10:38 p.m., heading east toward Interstate 40. Everything appeared normal, but when I compared this footage to the report of David being found at the same truck stop 72 hours later, something didn't add up. The security cameras showed David leaving on September 12th, but they also showed his truck returning and David being discovered unconscious in the cab on September 15th, according to the timestamps. His truck had been absent from the lot for exactly 72 hours and 14 minutes. I interviewed the driver who had found David on September 15th. Tommy Martinez was a regular customer at Desert Oasis who'd been concerned when he noticed a truck that had been parked in the same spot for what appeared to be several hours with the driver slumped over the steering wheel. I thought maybe the guy was sick or having a heart attack, Tommy told me. So I knocked on his window to check on him. He woke up confused, like he didn't know where he was or how he'd gotten there. Tommy had called 911, and David was taken to Barstow Community Hospital for evaluation. The medical examination found no signs of injury, drug use, or medical conditions that could explain his memory loss. His blood work was normal, his neurological function appeared intact, and he showed no signs of head trauma or psychiatric disturbance. But David's own account of what had happened was deeply troubling. I interviewed David at the hospital on September 16th, after he'd been cleared medically but was still struggling to piece together his missing time. He was a solid, practical man in his mid-40s, with the kind of straightforward demeanor you'd expect from someone who'd spent nearly 2 decades driving trucks across the country. "Detective Chun, I need you to understand that I've been doing this job for 18 years, he told me. I know every mile of Interstate 40 between California and Georgia. I know the truck stops, the way stations, the construction zones, everything. But I have no memory of anything that happened between leaving Barstow on September 12th and waking up in my truck 3 days later. What's the last thing you remember clearly?" I asked. Driving away from the Desert Oasis truck stop around 10:30 p.m., I was heading for the on-ramp to I-40 East, planning to drive through the night and stop for my mandatory rest break somewhere around Flagstaff. But the next thing I remember is waking up in the same parking spot at Desert Oasis with some guy knocking on my window. David's confusion was genuine and deeply disturbing. This wasn't someone trying to create an alibi or hide criminal activity. He was a man who had genuinely lost 72 hours of his life and had no explanation for what had happened during that time. "Have you checked the truck's GPS and electronic logs?" he asked. "Those systems track everything: location, speed, driving time, rest periods. If I drove anywhere during those 3 days, there should be a record." This was an excellent point. Modern commercial trucks are equipped with sophisticated electronic logging devices that monitor virtually every aspect of the vehicle's operation. These systems are required by federal law and are designed to prevent drivers from exceeding legal driving time limits. I obtained a warrant to examine David's truck and its electronic systems. What I found was impossible to explain logically. According to the truck's GPS system, the vehicle had remained parked at the Desert Oasis truck stop for the entire 72-hour period. There was no record of the truck moving, no log entries indicating travel, no GPS coordinates showing locations other than the Barstow truck stop. But this directly contradicted the security camera footage, which clearly showed the truck leaving on September 12th and returning on September 15th. The electronic logging device told the same story as the GPS. According to the truck's computer systems, David had been parked at Desert Oasis since 9:47 p.m. on September 12th, with no driving time recorded until September 15th when the truck was moved to allow access for emergency medical personnel. I brought this discrepancy to the attention of the truck stop security manager, thinking there might be an error in the camera timestamps or some kind of technical malfunction with the recording system. "Detective, I've checked and rechecked the footage," he told me. "The timestamps are accurate, and the system has been working normally. According to our cameras, that truck left our lot on the 12th and returned on the 15th. But according to the truck's own computers, it never moved." This was the first sign that David Kowalski's disappearance involved circumstances that couldn't be explained through conventional investigation methods. I decided to trace David's planned route to see if there were any reports of his truck being seen during the missing 72 hours. I contacted law enforcement agencies, weigh stations, and truck stops along Interstate 40 between Barstow and Flagstaff, asking if anyone had noticed David's distinctive blue Peterbilt during September 13th, 15th. The responses I received were troubling. Several truck stops reported seeing a blue Peterbilt matching David's description, but the sightings were scattered across impossible distances and time frames. A truck stop in Kingman, Arizona, had security footage showing David's truck stopping for fuel on September 13th at 2:17 a.m. The driver visible in the footage appeared to be David himself, though the image quality made positive identification difficult. But another truck stop in Gallup, New Mexico, reported seeing the same truck getting fuel at 2:31 a.m. on the same night, a distance of over 200 miles. That would have been impossible to cover in 14 minutes. Similar impossible sightings continued throughout the 72-hour period. David's truck was reportedly seen in Amarillo, Texas, Oklahoma City, Little Rock, Arkansas, and Birmingham, Alabama, all within timeframes that would have required the truck to travel at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. When I showed these reports to David, his confusion deepened rather than cleared. Detective, those are all stops I make on my regular route to Atlanta, he said. I know every one of those truck stops. I've probably fueled up at each of them 50 times over the years. But there's no way I could have hit all of them in a single night, and I have no memory of being at any of them during that someone had stolen David's truck and used it for some kind of elaborate criminal operation, possibly involving multiple drivers or some kind of sophisticated transportation scheme. But this theory had several problems. First, David's truck had been secured with multiple locks and alarm systems, and there was no sign of forced entry or tampering with the vehicle's security features. Second, the truck's electronic system showed no indication that anyone other than David had operated the vehicle. The seat position, mirror adjustments, and cabin settings were all exactly as David had left them. Third, and most importantly, the truck's cargo was intact and undisturbed. The electronics David was hauling to Atlanta were still properly secured and accounted for, ruling out cargo theft as a motive. I expanded the investigation to include federal agencies, thinking that the impossible travel patterns might indicate some kind of sophisticated criminal operation that crossed state lines. The FBI's Transportation Crimes Unit reviewed the case and agreed that the evidence didn't match any known patterns of truck theft or cargo crime. Agent Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in transportation-related federal crimes, was as puzzled as I was by the contradictory evidence. Detective Chun, in 20 years of investigating truck-related crimes, I've never seen anything like this, she told me. The electronic evidence clearly shows the truck never moved, but the visual evidence and witness reports indicate it traveled over 2,000 miles during a 72-hour period. Those two sets of facts can't both be true. Agent Mitchell suggested that we might be dealing with some kind of sophisticated electronic spoofing operation, where criminals had somehow manipulated the truck's GPS and logging systems to hide their activities. But when federal technicians examined David's truck systems, they found no evidence of tampering or electronic interference. The truck's computer systems had recorded normal operational data throughout the 72-hour period, but all of it indicated that the vehicle had remained stationary at the Desert Oasis truck stop. 3 weeks into the investigation, I decided to interview David again to see if any memories had returned or if he'd remembered additional details about his last clear memories. Before the disappearance, David met me at a coffee shop in Victorville, looking tired and stressed. The missing time had taken a significant toll on him psychologically, and he was struggling to return to normal life without understanding what had happened. Detective, my wife thinks I'm losing my mind, he told me. She's been researching memory disorders and brain diseases, trying to find a medical explanation for what happened. But every doctor who's examined me says I'm fine neurologically. Have you remembered anything new about that night at the truck stop? Actually, yes. It's probably not important, but I keep having these dreams about the trip I was supposed to make to Atlanta. Vivid dreams where I'm driving the route, stopping at all the usual truck stops, making the delivery on schedule. But in the dreams, something is wrong with the other people. Wrong how? David struggled to put his experience into words. In the dreams, I'm going through all the normal motions, fueling up, buying coffee, checking my logs. But the other people at the truck stops aren't quite right. They move too smoothly, like they're floating instead of walking. And their faces don't change expression when they talk. I asked David to describe these dreams in more detail, thinking they might represent suppressed memories of actual events during his missing time. The strangest part is that in the dreams, I know something is wrong, but I can't stop myself from going through the normal routine. It's like I'm watching myself from outside my body, seeing myself interact with these strange people, but I can't control what I'm doing or saying. David's description reminded me of accounts I'd heard from people who'd experienced dissociative episodes or certain types of psychological trauma. But it also sounded like the kind of detailed, consistent narrative that might represent actual memories rather than random dreams. I decided to visit the truck stops that had reported seeing David's truck during his missing time, hoping to find security footage or witnesses who could provide more specific information about his behavior during those visits. The truck stop in Kingman, Arizona, had preserved their security footage from September 13th. The manager, Bob Stevens, was cooperative and showed me the relevant recordings. The footage clearly showed David's truck arriving at 2:17 a.m. and a figure that appeared to be David getting out to fuel the vehicle. But when I watched the footage carefully, I noticed something that supported David's description of his dreams. The figure that looked like David moved differently than the David I'd interviewed. His movements were too smooth, too precise, lacking the natural human variations in gait and gesture that you'd expect from someone who'd been driving for hours. Bob, did your staff interact with this driver when he was here? Yeah, he came inside to pay for fuel and bought a coffee. My night cashier, Angela, said he seemed normal enough but kind of quiet, paid cash and left without any conversation. I asked to speak with Angela Martinez, the cashier who'd interacted with the driver. She was scheduled to work the following night, so I returned to interview her. Angela's description of her interaction with the driver was consistent with David's appearance and normal behavior, but she mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. He seemed normal, but there was something weird about his eyes, she told me. They didn't blink much, and when he looked at me, it felt like he was looking through me rather than at me. Like he was seeing something behind me that I couldn't see. This detail was particularly significant because it matched descriptions I'd heard in other cases involving people who'd experienced unexplained, missing time or altered states of consciousness. Visited the other truck stops that had reported sightings of David's truck, conducting similar interviews and reviewing available security footage. The pattern was consistent across all locations. A figure that appeared to be David going through normal truck stop routines, but with subtle behavioral anomalies that suggested something was wrong. Asterisk at the truck stop in Gallup, New Mexico, the night manager reported that the driver had seemed confused about which fuel pump he was supposed to use, standing between pumps for several minutes as if he couldn't decide or remember what he was supposed to be doing. In Amarillo, Texas, the cashier remembered that the driver had paid for fuel and then stood at the counter for nearly 5 minutes without speaking, as if he was waiting for instructions that never came. These accounts painted a picture of someone going through the motions of normal trucking activities, but lacking the purposeful intention and situational awareness that experienced drivers typically display. I began to suspect that David might have experienced some kind of dissociative fugue state, a rare psychological condition where people perform complex activities while in an altered state of consciousness and later have no memory of their actions. But this theory didn't explain the electronic evidence showing that David's truck had never left the Barstow truck stop, or the impossible travel times between various sightings. 4 weeks into the investigation, I decided to consult with Dr. Marcus Webb, a psychiatrist who specialized in dissociative disorders and unusual states of consciousness. Dr. Webb had worked with law enforcement before on cases involving memory loss and unexplained behavior. After reviewing the case files and interviewing David, Dr. Webb offered a perspective that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. "Detective Chen, this case doesn't fit any standard pattern of dissociative disorder or memory loss that I'm familiar with," he told me. "The consistency and detail of the witness reports, combined with the contradictory electronic evidence, suggests we might be dealing with something outside the normal range of psychiatric or neurological conditions." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that David Kowalski might have experienced something that our current understanding of consciousness and reality can't adequately explain. There are documented cases of people reporting similar experiences, detailed memories of activities that electronic evidence suggests couldn't have occurred." Dr. Webb showed me research papers describing what some scientists called consciousness displacement events, rare occurrences, where people reported vivid experiences of being in multiple locations simultaneously or performing activities that couldn't be verified through conventional means. The common thread in these cases is that the affected individuals weren't suffering from any identifiable mental illness or neurological condition. They were psychologically normal people who'd experienced something that challenged our basic assumptions about the nature of consciousness and physical reality. This perspective opened up possibilities that I hadn't previously considered, but it also moved the investigation into territory where conventional police work might not be adequate. I decided to approach the case from a different angle, focusing on whether there had been any unusual phenomena or reports in the areas where David's truck had supposedly been sighted during his missing time. I contacted local law enforcement agencies along David's supposed route, asking if there had been any unusual incidents, UFO reports, electromagnetic anomalies, or other unexplained phenomena during September 13th to 15th, 2024 were surprising. Several agencies reported unusual electromagnetic interference with radio communications during those dates. The Arizona State Police had received multiple reports of drivers experiencing GPS malfunctions along Interstate 40. The New Mexico Department of Transportation had documented unexplained traffic light malfunctions in several towns along David's route. Most intriguingly, the National Weather Service had recorded unusual atmospheric electromagnetic readings in the same general area and timeframe as David's disappearance. I brought these findings to Agent Mitchell, hoping that federal resources might help us understand whether these phenomena were connected to David's case. "Detective, you're moving into territory that's outside normal FBI jurisdiction," she told me. "But there are federal agencies that investigate unusual phenomena that might be related to what you found." Agent Mitchell connected me with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a physicist who worked with a classified federal program that investigated unexplained electromagnetic and consciousness-related phenomena. Dr. Rodriguez agreed to review David's case unofficially, though she made it clear that any findings would not be part of the official FBI investigation. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis of the case was both illuminating and disturbing. "The electromagnetic anomalies you've documented are consistent with what we've observed in other cases involving temporal or consciousness displacement," she told me. "The pattern suggests the possibility that David experienced what we might call a temporal bifurcation event. Can you explain that in terms a police detective can understand?" Imagine that consciousness isn't always completely tied to a single physical body in a single location. Under certain circumstances, usually involving strong electromagnetic fields or other environmental factors we don't fully understand. It might be possible for someone's consciousness to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Dr. Rodriguez suggested that David might have experienced a situation where his consciousness operated in two parallel tracks, one where his physical body remained parked at the truck stop, and another where his consciousness continued the trip to Atlanta, interacting with people and environments while his physical body remained stationary. This would explain why the truck's electronic systems show no movement while multiple witnesses reported seeing David at various locations. His physical body never left Barstow, but his consciousness completed the journey he'd intended to make. This explanation sounded like science fiction, but it was the only theory that accounted for all the contradictory evidence in David's case. I presented these findings to my supervisor, Captain James Morrison, who listened patiently but ultimately decided that the case had moved beyond the scope of normal police investigation. "Detective Chun, you've done excellent work documenting the facts of this case," he told me. "But we can't file a report that concludes a missing person was simultaneously in multiple locations due to consciousness displacement. The case will have to remain classified as unsolved, pending the discovery of additional conventional evidence." I understood Captain Morrison's position, but I felt obligated to share my findings with David and his family. They deserved to know what I'd discovered, even if it couldn't be part of an official police report. When I met with David to close the case, I explained everything I'd learned about the electromagnetic anomalies, the witness reports, and the theory of consciousness displacement. David listened carefully to my explanation, and for the first time since I'd met him, he seemed relieved rather than confused. "Detective, that actually makes sense to me," he said. "I've been having those dreams about the trip to Atlanta almost every night since this happened. But they're not really dreams. They're too detailed, too consistent. It's like I'm remembering something that actually happened, even though I know my body was in Barstow the whole time." "Have you remembered anything else about the experience?" "Actually, yes. I remember making the delivery in Atlanta on schedule. I remember the dock workers who unloaded my trailer, the paperwork I filled out, even the conversation I had with the shipping manager about the next load I was supposed to pick up." David provided details about his delivery to Atlanta that I was able to verify. The electronics had indeed been delivered on September 15th, the same day David was found unconscious in Barstow. The delivery had been made by a driver who matched David's description, and all the paperwork had been completed correctly, but according to the shipping company's records, the delivery driver had provided identification showing that he was David Kowalski, even though David's physical body had been unconscious in California at the time. This final piece of evidence convinced me that David had experienced something beyond conventional explanation. Somehow, his consciousness had completed his intended route while his physical body remained stationary, allowing him to fulfill his professional obligations despite never actually making the trip. The shipping company provided copies of the delivery documentation, including a signature that was verified as matching David's handwriting. Security footage from the Atlanta distribution center showed a figure that appeared to be David completing the delivery process normally. But when I showed this footage to David, he had no conscious memory of being in Atlanta or making the delivery. "I remember it like a dream," he told me. "I can see myself doing all those things, but it doesn't feel like a normal memory. It's like watching a movie of myself rather than remembering something I actually experienced." 6 months after David's disappearance, I was assigned to a similar case involving a long-haul trucker who'd lost 48 hours and been found unconscious in his cab with no memory of the missing time. The electronic evidence again showed that his truck had never moved, while witness reports placed him at multiple locations hundreds of miles apart. I realized that David's case wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of unexplained phenomena affecting interstate truckers. The long hours, isolated driving conditions, and exposure to various electromagnetic fields along major highways might create conditions where consciousness displacement events were more likely to occur. I began quietly documenting these cases, building a database of similar incidents that law enforcement agencies across the country had encountered, but couldn't explain through conventional investigation methods. Over the next 2 years, I collected reports of over 30 similar cases involving truckers, traveling salespeople, and other professional drivers who'd experienced missing time, accompanied by contradictory evidence about their whereabouts during the missing periods. The pattern was consistent. Experienced drivers with no history of mental illness or substance abuse would lose anywhere from 12 hours to several days of memory. Electronic evidence would suggest they'd remain stationary while witness. Reports and security footage would place them at multiple impossible locations. In every case, the affected drivers eventually recovered psychologically, but retained fragmentary dreamlike memories of completing their intended routes despite never physically making the journeys. Dr. Webb, the psychiatrist who'd consulted on David's case, agreed to help me research the psychological aspects of these incidents. His findings suggested that the affected drivers weren't suffering from conventional mental health conditions but were experiencing something that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. These cases suggest that human consciousness might be far more flexible and less tied to physical location than we've traditionally assumed, he told me. Under certain environmental conditions, it might be possible for consciousness to operate independently of the physical body, completing complex tasks and interacting with other people while the body remains in a different location. The implications of this research were staggering, but they also explained anomalies that conventional psychology and neuroscience couldn't account for. I presented my findings to a conference of law enforcement professionals who specialized in missing persons cases. The response was mixed. Some investigators reported similar cases in their jurisdictions, while others dismissed the research as unscientific speculation. But several federal agencies expressed interest in the patterns I documented. Within a year, I was invited to join a classified federal program that investigated unexplained phenomena related to consciousness and human perception. The program brought together law enforcement professionals, scientists, and military personnel who'd encountered evidence of consciousness-related anomalies in their work. Our mission was to document and study these phenomena while maintaining public safety and national security. Through this program, I learned that David Kowalski's experience was part of a much larger pattern of unexplained phenomena affecting people who worked in isolated conditions or were exposed to specific environmental factors. Military personnel, emergency responders, night shift workers, and long-distance travelers all showed higher than normal rates of consciousness displacement events. The research suggested that human consciousness was far more complex and capable than mainstream science recognized, and that certain environmental conditions could trigger abilities that most people never experienced. Returned to truck driving after taking several months off to recover from his experience. He reported no further missing time incidents, but he mentioned that his awareness during long drives had changed significantly. I feel more connected to the road and to other drivers than I used to, he told me during a follow-up interview. It's like I can sense things about traffic conditions or potential problems before they become visible. My driving performance has actually improved since the incident. This enhanced awareness was another common pattern among people who'd experienced consciousness displacement events. Many reported improved intuitive abilities, better situational awareness, and an expanded sense of connection to their environment. The federal program I joined eventually classified David's case and the related research under national security provisions. The implications of consciousness displacement phenomena were considered too sensitive for public release due to potential impacts on transportation safety, national defense, and social stability, but I continued to investigate similar cases privately, helping families understand what their loved ones had experienced while maintaining the confidentiality required by my federal clearance, the truth about human consciousness and its relationship to physical reality is far more complex than most people realize. The cases I've investigated suggest that under certain conditions, consciousness can operate independently of the physical body, completing complex tasks and maintaining social interactions while the body remains in a different location. These phenomena aren't supernatural or mystical. They represent natural capabilities of human consciousness that science is only beginning to understand. But they challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of identity, reality, and the relationship between mind and body. If you're a professional driver or someone who works in isolated conditions, pay attention to any episodes of missing time or memories that seem too detailed to be dreams. These experiences might represent consciousness displacement events rather than mental health issues. Document everything you can remember, no matter how strange or impossible it seems. Your experiences might be part of a larger pattern that science is still working to understand. And remember that human consciousness is far more capable and flexible than most people imagine. The boundaries between mind and body, between individual awareness and collective reality, might be more permeable than we've traditionally believed. David Kowalski's 72-hour journey taught me that the question isn't whether consciousness displacement events are possible, but how often they occur without being recognized or documented. The human mind might be capable of extraordinary things that we're only beginning to discover. My name is Officer Patricia Williams, and I've been with the Nevada State Police for 11 years. During that time, I've investigated countless cases of missing persons, suspicious deaths, and unexplained disappearances along the isolated highways that crisscross our state. But the discovery I made at the Desert Moon Motel outside of Tonopah has haunted me for 3 years and changed my understanding of how people can simply vanish without leaving behind any conventional evidence of what happened to them. The case began on October 8, 2023, when the motel owner, Frank Castillo, called to report that one of his long-term guests had checked out without settling his bill. This wasn't unusual in itself. The Desert Moon catered to transient workers, traveling salespeople, and others who might leave unexpectedly. But what concerned Frank was that the guest, a man named Robert Chun, had left behind all his personal belongings, including his car, and hadn't been seen for over a week. Officer Williams, I've been running this place for 23 years, Frank told me when I arrived to investigate. People skip out on their bills all the time, but they don't usually leave their cars and all their stuff behind. Something doesn't feel right about this situation. Robert Chun had been staying in room 112 for 6 weeks, paying weekly in cash and keeping to himself. According to Frank, Robert worked as a traveling insurance adjuster and used the motel as a base while investigating claims throughout central Nevada. He seemed like a normal guy, Frank explained. Quiet, professional, never caused any problems. Paid on time, didn't bring visitors or party, the kind of guest motel owners appreciate. Frank had given Robert until October 1st to pay his weekly rent, but when Robert didn't show up, Frank had waited an additional week before calling the police. He'd knocked on the door of room 112 several times and eventually used his master key to check on Robert's welfare. The room was empty, but all his stuff was still there, Frank said. Clothes in the dresser, toiletries in the bathroom, papers spread out on the desk like he'd just stepped out for a few minutes. Even his laptop was open with some kind of document on the screen. Frank showed me to room 112, and I immediately understood his concern. The room looked like someone had just stepped out momentarily rather than permanently vacated. Robert's belongings were organized and well-maintained, suggesting someone who planned to return soon rather than someone preparing to abandon everything. What caught my attention immediately was a leather-bound journal sitting open on the desk next to Robert's laptop. The journal appeared to be a daily diary, with entries dating back several months. The laptop screen showed what appeared to be the same diary entries, typed and formatted like a manuscript that I began reading the journal to understand. Robert's state of mind and activities during his stay at the Desert Moon. What I found was a detailed record of increasingly strange experiences that suggested Robert Chun had encountered something extraordinary during his time in Nevada. Early entries were routine and professional. Robert documented his work activities, insurance claims he was investigating, and his impressions of the various small towns he visited. His writing was clear, organized, and focused on practical matters, but starting in late August, the entries began to describe experiences that were harder to explain rationally. August 28, 2023. Investigated a fire. Claim at a ranch house about 40 miles north of Tonopah. The property owner, Mrs. Sarah Martinez, was cooperative and provided all necessary documentation, but something about the scene bothered me. The fire damage patterns were consistent with the claim, but there were scorch marks on the ground around the house that couldn't be explained by the reported fire. When I asked Mrs. Martinez about them, she said they'd been there for years and had nothing to do with the insurance claim. Drove back to the motel as the sun was setting. Noticed lights in the desert that didn't correspond to any structures I could see on the horizon. Bright, white lights that moved in patterns too organized to be natural phenomena. Probably aircraft from the nearby military testing area, but the movement patterns were unusual. September 3, 2023. Had strange dreams last night about walking through the desert and finding structures that weren't there during the day. In the dream, I could see buildings, roads, even what appeared to be an entire town that existed in the same location as empty desert. The dream was so vivid that I drove out to the area this morning to check. Found nothing but sagebrush and sand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at the wrong layer of reality. Note: I've been working insurance claims for 12 years, and I pride myself on being observant and detail-oriented. These experiences are outside my normal frame of reference, but I'm documenting them in case there's a pattern that becomes relevant to my work. September 10th, 2023. Encountered something today that I can't explain through normal means. Was driving Highway 6 toward Ely to investigate a vandalism claim when I noticed a gas station that wasn't on my GPS or road maps. The station appeared to be operational, with vehicles at the pumps and customers going in and out of the convenience store. I stopped to get coffee and asked for directions to the property I was supposed to inspect. The gas station seemed normal until I tried to pay for my coffee. The cashier was a woman in her 50s who looked at me with complete confusion when I handed her cash. She didn't seem to understand what money was for or why I was trying to give it to her. After several minutes of awkward interaction, she told me that coffee was always free and seemed surprised that I'd expected to pay. When I returned to my car, I noticed that the other customers were all doing the same things in repetitive patterns. One man filled his gas tank, went inside for exactly 3 minutes, came out, and drove away. Then he appeared again 5 minutes later and repeated the exact same sequence. Same clothes, same movements, same 3-minute interval inside the store. I left immediately and tried to find the gas station again on my return trip. The location showed only empty desert. Checked with local authorities and gas station chains. No record of any station at that location. Asterisk as I continued reading. Robert's entries documented increasingly impossible experiences. He described encountering entire towns that appeared at night and vanished during the day, meeting people who seemed to be stuck in time loops, and discovering buildings that existed in some locations. 17th, 2023. I'm beginning to understand that something fundamental about reality is different in this part of Nevada. The experiences I've been having aren't hallucinations or psychological episodes. They're encounters with layers of existence that most people can't perceive. Today I met another insurance adjuster, A woman named Lisa Wong, who told me she'd been working claims in Nevada for 8 years and had experienced similar phenomena. According to Lisa, there are areas throughout the state where reality seems to operate by different rules. She said that insurance companies are aware of these locations and often assign their most experienced adjusters to handle claims in what they privately refer to as anomalous zones. Lisa showed me a map marking locations where adjusters had reported unexplained experiences. The Desert Moon Motel was marked with a red circle and the notation high probability of temporal displacement events. I asked what that meant, and she said some places seem to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. September 22nd, 2023. I've decided to extend my stay at the Desert Moon indefinitely. My supervisor at the insurance company has agreed to let me work remotely on cases throughout Nevada while using the motel as my base. Officially, this is about convenience and cost savings. Unofficially, I want to understand what's happening in this area. Frank, the motel owner, seems to know more than he initially let on. When I told him I was extending my stay, he nodded like he'd expected it and said, "Most people who stay here long enough start to see things differently." I asked what he meant, and he said the motel has been attracting certain types of people for decades: investigators, researchers, people who are sensitive to unusual phenomena. The Desert Moon sits on what you might call a thin place, Frank explained. The boundary between different realities is weaker here. Some people notice it right away, others never see anything unusual. But the ones who do notice tend to stay longer than they planned. September 28, 2023, had my first direct encounter with what Lisa called a temporal displacement event. Was investigating a claim at an abandoned mine about 50 miles east of the motel. The mine had supposedly been closed since 1987, but when I arrived, it was fully operational with workers, equipment, and activity that suggested active mining operations. I spoke with the foreman, a man named Jack Sullivan, who told me the mine had been producing silver and copper continuously since 1923. He showed me production records, safety reports, and employee files that documented decades of normal operations. When I mentioned that my information showed the mine had been closed for 36 years, he looked at me like I was confused. I spent 3 hours documenting the mine's current operations for my insurance report. But when I returned the next day to follow up on some questions, I found only rusted equipment and boarded up mine shafts. No sign of the active operations I'd witnessed 24 hours earlier. Called the county assessor's office to verify the mine's status. They confirmed that the mine had been closed since 1987 and that no permits for reopening had been issued. But I have photographs, documentation, and detailed notes from my visit to an active mining operation at the same location, October 2nd, 2023. I'm beginning to understand that the Desert Moon Motel exists at the intersection of multiple realities. From my room, I can sometimes see different versions of the surrounding area. During the day, I see the normal Nevada desert, empty land, distant mountains, the occasional vehicle on Highway 6, but at night, especially during the hours between 2 and 4 a.m., I can see lights and structures that suggest a much more populated and developed area. Last night, I watched what appeared to be a small city existing in the same location as empty desert. I could see buildings, traffic, people going about their normal evening activities. The city looked like it might have existed in the 1950s or early 1960s. Based on the architecture and the style of cars I could make out, I tried walking toward the city lights, but as I got closer, they seemed to recede, always staying just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. After walking for about 30 minutes, I realized I was back at the motel parking lot. Even though I'd been walking in a straight line away from it, Frank was sitting on the porch when I returned, smoking a cigarette and watching the horizon, where I'd seen the city lights. "You saw Atomic City," he said without being asked. "That's what folks around here call it." It was built in the early 1950s to house workers from the nuclear testing program. But it exists about 30 years in. The past from our current time. October 5th, 2023. Frank has been sharing more information about the area's unusual properties. According to him, the atomic testing that took place in Nevada during the 1950s and 1960s did more than contaminate the soil with radiation. The massive releases of energy somehow weakened the barriers between different time periods and realities. The government knows about it, Frank told me. They've had researchers coming through here for decades, trying to understand what happened and whether it can be controlled or reversed. Most of the motel's long-term guests are connected to various research programs, either officially or unofficially. I asked why he allowed researchers to use his motel as a base of operations. Frank said his family had owned the land since before the atomic testing began, and they'd witnessed the changes that occurred after the first nuclear explosions. My grandfather saw the first atomic bomb test from this location in 1945, Frank explained. After that, reality started getting fuzzy around here. Time doesn't work the same way it does in other places. My family has been documenting the phenomena for 3 generations, hoping someone would eventually figure out how to fix it. October 7th, 2023. I've made a discovery that explains why insurance companies assign experienced adjusters to this area. Many of the claims I've been investigating involve properties and incidents that exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. A building might burn down in 1987, but still exist in perfect condition in 2023. A car accident from 1963 might leave wreckage that appears fresh and recent to investigators, who know how to perceive the different temporal layers. The insurance companies have been quietly paying claims on properties and incidents that technically haven't happened yet or occurred decades ago. They employ adjusters who can navigate temporal anomalies to verify that the claims are legitimate within their respective time periods. I found a file in my laptop that I don't remember creating, containing detailed reports on 17 claims. I don't remember investigating, but the reports are in my writing style and contain information that I somehow know to be accurate. According to the timestamps, I wrote these reports during periods when I was asleep or working on other cases. Asterisk. Think I'm experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously. Part of my consciousness is investigating insurance claims in 2023, while another part is working the same territory in different time periods, the 1950s, 1960s, 1980s. All versions of myself are staying at the Desert Moon Motel and documenting their experiences in the same diary. That was the last entry in Robert Chun's handwritten journal. But the laptop contained additional entries that continued the story, each one time-stamped at impossible intervals that suggested they were being written simultaneously by different versions of Robert, existing in different time periods. I scrolled through the digital entries, which became increasingly fragmented and difficult to follow. Some were written from the perspective of Robert working as an insurance adjuster in the 1950s, investigating claims related to atomic testing and the construction of Atomic City. Others described investigations in the 1960s, 1980s, and time periods that seemed to be decades in the future. The final digital entry was dated October 8, 2023, the same day Frank had called to report Robert missing. October 8, 2023 to 3:47 a.m. I understand now what's happening to me. The Desert Moon Motel doesn't just exist at the intersection of multiple realities. It's a collection point for people who become dispersed across multiple time periods. I'm not missing from 2023. I'm simply existing in too many different times to maintain a stable presence in any single timeline. Asterisk. Frank was right when he said that most people who stay here long enough start to see things differently. What he didn't explain is that some people eventually become part of the temporal anomalies themselves. I'm becoming scattered across the decades, investigating insurance claims in multiple time periods simultaneously. I can see myself in room 112 in 1953. DOCUMENG radiation exposure claims for atomic testing workers. I can see myself in 1967, investigating property damage from underground nuclear explosions. I can see myself in 1989, working claims related to cleanup efforts at contaminated sites. All these versions of myself are real. All are staying at the desert moon. All are writing this will be my final in the same linear time. After tonight, I'll exist primarily in the temporal anomaly zone, moving between different time periods as needed to complete investigations that span decades. I won't disappear in the conventional sense. I'll just be working in too many different times to maintain a consistent presence in any single timeline. If someone finds this diary, please understand that I chose this transition willingly. The work I'm doing across multiple time periods is important. Insurance claims in temporal anomaly zones require adjusters who can perceive and navigate different realities. I'm becoming the kind of adjuster that this area requires. Tell my supervisor at the insurance company that I'll continue submitting reports, but they may arrive at irregular intervals and cover incidents from various time periods. The claims are all legitimate. They just exist in different layers of reality than most people can perceive. To whoever finds this diary, the Desert Moon Motel is a gateway between time periods. Stay if you're called to work that transcends normal temporal boundaries. Leave if you want to maintain existence in a single timeline. But choose carefully. The transition is permanent. After reading Robert's journal and laptop entries, I understood that I was dealing with something beyond conventional police investigation. Robert Chun hadn't disappeared in any traditional sense. He had become dispersed across multiple time periods, continuing his work as an insurance adjuster in a way that transcended normal temporal limitations. I interviewed Frank Castillo again, this time asking specific questions about the motel's history and the temporal anomalies that Robert had documented. Frank was more forthcoming during this second interview, perhaps recognizing that I'd already learned too much to be dismissed with conventional explanations. Officer Williams, the Desert Moon has been serving as a research station for temporal anomalies since the late 1940s, he told me. My family has been the official caretakers, but we work with various government agencies and research organizations to document and study the phenomena. Why didn't you tell me this initially? Because most law enforcement officers aren't prepared to handle cases involving temporal displacement. We have protocols for working with investigators who demonstrate the ability to perceive anomalous phenomena, but standard police procedures don't apply to situations like Robert's. Frank showed me guest records dating back to 1947. The Desert Moon had hosted hundreds of researchers, investigators, and specialists who'd come to study the temporal anomalies created by atomic testing. Some had completed their research and returned to normal lives. Others, like Robert Chun, had chosen to integrate with the anomalous zone and continue their work across multiple time periods. Robert isn't the first insurance adjuster to make this transition, Frank explained. The companies that handle claims in temporal anomaly zones need adjusters who can operate outside normal time constraints. Robert is continuing his work, just not in the way that conventional employment records can track. I asked Frank to show me any evidence of Robert's continued activity. He led me to a filing cabinet in the motel office that contained insurance reports submitted by Robert Chun, all dated after his disappearance but covering claims from various decades. The reports were clearly written by Robert, using his distinctive terminology and analytical approach. But they documented properties and incidents from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and other time periods, all investigated with the thoroughness and attention to detail that characterized Robert's professional work. The insurance companies receive these reports and process the claims normally, Frank told me. Robert is still doing his job, He's just doing it across multiple decades simultaneously. I contacted Robert's supervisor at the insurance company, hoping to verify Frank's claims about continued report submissions. The supervisor, Janet Morrison, was initially reluctant to discuss Robert's case, but eventually confirmed that her company had been receiving reports from Robert Chun, despite his official missing person status. Officer Williams, Robert's disappearance is complicated by the nature of the work he was doing in Nevada, she told me. Our company handles claims in areas affected by atomic testing, and sometimes our adjusters encounter situations that can't be explained through conventional means. Are you saying that your company knowingly employs people who work across multiple time periods? I'm saying that insurance claims in temporal anomaly zones require adjusters who can perceive and navigate different realities. Robert Chun has become exceptionally qualified for this type of work, even if his employment status doesn't fit standard corporate categories. Janet explained that several insurance companies had developed specialized departments to handle claims in areas affected by atomic testing and other phenomena that created temporal anomalies. These departments employed adjusters who could investigate incidents that existed in multiple time periods or realities simultaneously. Robert's reports are always accurate and thoroughly documented, she said. The fact that he's investigating claims from different decades doesn't affect the validity of his work. If anything, his ability to access multiple time periods makes him more effective at handling complex cases. I realized that Robert Chun's disappearance represented a transition, rather than a missing person case. He had evolved from a conventional insurance adjuster working in linear time to a temporal investigator who could handle claims that spanned multiple decades. The question remained whether this transition had been voluntary or whether Robert had been trapped by circumstances beyond his control. I returned to the Desert Moon Motel and spent several nights in room 112, hoping to experience the temporal anomalies that Robert had documented. I wanted to understand whether his transition had been a choice or an accident. During my third night in the room, I began to perceive the phenomena that Robert had described. Between 2 and 4 a.m., I could see lights and structures that suggested a populated area where only empty desert existed during daylight hours. I also began to experience what felt like memories of events I hadn't personally lived through. I could recall investigating insurance claims in different time periods, meeting people who'd lived decades ago, documenting incidents that had occurred before I was born. These experiences felt as real and detailed as my actual memories of police work. I could remember specific conversations, exact details of property damage, precise measurements and observations from investigations that I somehow knew I'd conducted in different time periods. On my fourth night in room 112, I encountered Robert Chun directly. He appeared in the room around 3:30 a.m., looking exactly as he did in the photographs I'd seen, but with an otherworldly quality that suggested he wasn't entirely present in the current time period. "Officer Williams," he said, his voice carrying an echo that seemed to come from multiple time periods simultaneously. "I appreciate your investigation into my disappearance, but I need you to understand that I'm not missing in any conventional sense. Where have you been for the past month?" "I've been working," Robert replied, "investigating insurance claims across multiple decades. The work I'm doing now requires me to exist in different time periods simultaneously, which makes it impossible to maintain a stable presence in any single timeline." Robert explained that his transition to temporal investigative work had been voluntary, though he admitted that the choice had been influenced by his prolonged exposure to the anomalous environment around the Desert Moon Motel. The atomic testing that took place in Nevada created weak points in the fabric of reality, he told me. These weak points allow people with the right sensitivity to perceive and navigate multiple time periods. Insurance claims in these areas require investigators who can access different layers of temporal reality. Could you return to normal linear existence if you wanted to? Theoretically, yes, Robert said. But it would mean abandoning important work that needs to be done. The claims I'm investigating span decades and involve people whose losses occurred in different time periods. Conventional adjusters can't access the information needed to process these claims fairly. Robert showed me a stack of insurance reports that documented claims from various decades, all requiring investigation techniques that transcended normal temporal limitations. The work was complex and important, requiring someone who could perceive the full scope of damage and loss across multiple time periods. I'm needed here, Officer Williams. This work gives meaning to my existence in a way that conventional insurance adjustment never did. I'm helping people receive compensation for losses that occurred across multiple decades, providing closure for families who've been waiting years or decades for resolution. I asked Robert if he had any message for his family or colleagues in the conventional timeline. He said that he'd already communicated with them through means that transcended normal temporal communication, and that they understood his choice to continue his work in the anomalous zone. Robert gave me a final piece of advice. If you're called to work that transcends normal reality, don't dismiss it as impossible. Some of the most important work that needs to be done exists outside conventional understanding of space and time. After my encounter with Robert Chun, I completed my official report, classifying his case as a voluntary disappearance with no evidence of foul play. But I included detailed documentation of the temporal anomalies surrounding the desert moon, motel, and recommendations for specialized training for officers who might encounter similar cases in the future. My supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, reviewed my report with skepticism but ultimately accepted my conclusions. He noted that several other law enforcement agencies in Nevada had encountered similar cases involving people who'd transitioned to work in temporal anomaly zones. Officer Williams, your investigation was thorough and professional, he told me. But this case represents phenomena that are outside normal police jurisdiction. I'm recommending that future cases involving temporal anomalies be referred to federal agencies that specialize in unusual phenomena. 6 months later, I was contacted by Dr. Elena Santos, a researcher with a classified federal program that investigated temporal anomalies and consciousness-related phenomena. She offered me a position as a liaison officer, helping to coordinate between local law enforcement and federal researchers who studied cases like Robert Chun's disappearance. I accepted the position and have spent the past 3 years investigating cases involving people who've transitioned to work in anomalous zones throughout the American West. The atomic testing that took place during the 1950s and 1960s created numerous weak points in reality, and these areas continue to attract individuals who develop the ability to perceive and navigate multiple time periods. Robert Chun's case taught me that disappearance doesn't always mean loss. Sometimes it means transition to a different type of existence that serves purposes beyond conventional understanding. The work being done by temporal investigators like Robert is important and necessary. Insurance claims, historical research, and other investigations that span multiple decades require people who can access different layers of reality. If you encounter evidence of temporal anomalies, or meet people who claim to work across multiple time periods, document everything carefully and report your findings to appropriate authorities. These phenomena are real and significant, even if they challenge conventional understanding of reality. The boundaries between past, present, and future are more permeable than most people realize. In certain locations, under specific conditions, dedicated individuals can transcend normal temporal limitations to serve purposes that span decades or centuries. Robert Chun chose to become a temporal investigator, sacrificing his existence in linear time to provide services that conventional reality couldn't offer. His diary documents the transition from normal insurance work to investigation that transcends temporal boundaries. If you find yourself called to similar work, Consider carefully whether you're prepared to abandon conventional existence for service that spans multiple realities. The transition is permanent, but the work serves purposes that normal careers cannot fulfill.